Ladies and gentlemen, today is December the 18th, 2022, and we are here for another episode of World Discussion with Agent Smith. And I've been doing the subathon for 19 days now, so we're hanging in there. We are just a couple days off the 3-week cap. You can see the timer on the screen here, and you'll see it in the StarCraft scene as well. Without further ado, I will jump into chat with Mr. Agent Smith. If you have any questions or critiques, feel free to put them in the Twitch chat or the YouTube comments. Agent Smith.
Oh, how are you?
Good. How are you doing?
Oh, can't complain. Member of the household got COVID, so we're having to be careful, basically.
Oh, the floor is lava. Gotcha.
Yeah. Yeah, so that's been interesting.
Mm-hmm.
I'm a little more pessimistic about it than she is. I just kind of assume I'm going to get it at this point.
Yeah. Do you know if you've ever gotten it up to this point or no?
I don't think so.
Oh.
But I've also been vaxxed up, so I'm not too worried about it.
Mm-hmm.
I just got a booster a few weeks ago, I think.
Boosted.
Yeah.
I just got the one J&J and I haven't been boosted at all. I think I got COVID twice, if I had to guess. The first time was like right when it was hitting Seattle initially. I went to get my mail and I think that's what got me, because people probably were around that area touching stuff and that kind of a thing. And I think it was right as the news of it was breaking, so I wasn't really prepared or trying to be safe about it. And then another time I visited family in South Dakota, and they don't give a fuck there, and nobody had masks, and our whole family got sick. And I was pretty sick for a few days. That one definitely hit me harder. It was like wanting to be in bed and feeling kind of feverish for about 3 days. But fortunately, I got a new Pokemon game and a Nintendo DS at the same time, so I was able to still like pass the time and do something pretty fun.
Thank God for Pokemon.
Yes.
Yeah, we're not the only ones. China's been getting hit pretty hard past couple weeks. Pretty much everybody I know over there has come down with it in the past week or two. And their families, for that matter.
You said they had the zero COVID. Have they loosened that up at all?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, pretty considerably. It's very much at the discretion of localities how strict they want to be, but for the most part, everybody has just very much weakened all of the previous restrictions. So testing requirements are loosened, travel restrictions have been significantly weakened, just anything and everything. I think the government even shut down its backtracing app. There's still local apps, local and province levels apps that are, still being used, but the national government, I think, said that they were going to, if they haven't already, shut it down. So they're pretty much just kind of letting it rip at this point. And it's been on quite the tear.
Yeah, you would expect it to if they've been more isolated. Have they been as vaxxed as other places are, or no?
No, no, I think vaccination rates are something like 60 to 70%, which is lower than other areas. The trouble is that a lot of the remainder that has not been vaccinated is concentrated amongst the most vulnerable population, that being older folks. They, in particular, are pretty skeptical about vaccines. Well, COVID vaccines specifically. I don't know if they're skeptical about other vaccines. But even among younger people, they tend to be a little cagey about whether or not they really trust the Chinese-made vaccines. They're a little wary. There's been a lot of scandals in China over the past 10, 20 years about people coming down with, food poisoning because some food was made in a shady way, or medicines that were made in a shady way and made people sick. So there's a certain amount of institutionalized suspicion as to the veracity and safety of goods and service, well, goods anyway, in China. Uh, it's gotten better over time in that regard. I think I even read a month or two ago that the baby formula market in China is starting to kind of take off. That is to say, the domestically made baby formula market, which was very much not the case even a few years ago. There was a big scandal when some children died because of some tainted baby formula. And the market in China just kind of imploded. Pretty much everybody just started buying imported stuff. That was a big boon for New Zealand. Most of the milk and produce being used was sourced from there.
Hmm.
And so they made quite a bit of money off of that. And I think that pretty much lasted more than a decade, up until maybe just the past year or two, when the domestic producers started finally kind of recovering some market share and getting back some of the public's confidence.
Mhm.
So, yeah, I think that combined with just general suspicion of the authoritarian one party state has made people a little suspicious of the safety of the vaccines in China. So, not everybody really wants to use them or does. And the result is that the population as a whole is a little bit under-vaccinated compared to peer countries.
Do they ever import vaccines from other countries, like the ones that we have available?
Now, see, that's an interesting question because one of the points of criticism that have been levied against China has been that they are not importing foreign vaccines. They're very much pushing native made vaccines. They've actually made, I think, three or four now of their own COVID vaccines. So it's not that they're incapable of doing it, they've done it. And I think they've been tested outside of China and they've been found to be fairly effective. I don't think the effectiveness is as great as, say, some of the American or European vaccines,
Mm-hmm.
but it's decent. Like if everybody took it, they'd probably be okay. But not everybody is. But anyway, no, they're not importing foreign vaccines. The government is very much making this I guess you could say it's almost a point of pride, if not a point of nationalism, that China should be able to vaccinate its own people with its own vaccines.
Mm-hmm.
But again, that doesn't really work too well when your own people kind of don't trust you.
Mm-hmm.
So they would probably be better off just importing. It's not. Some people would use the Chinese-made stuff, others would use the foreign-made stuff. The important thing should be ensuring that as many people get vaccinated as possible. But the government isn't really thinking in those terms at this point. We'll see what happens. The big concern is that if the Chinese government, well, the big concern is that if the contagion spreads even further than it already is, and it looks set to, then China's healthcare infrastructure will just be overwhelmed because they haven't really invested enough in it. China has made big strides over the past couple of decades, but it's still really a developing country. And you can especially see that in some of the interior areas of China that haven't seen as much economic growth. So in those areas in particular, the healthcare infrastructure just kind of isn't there, at least not in a significant enough degree to really weather the storm of a widespread outbreak of COVID-19, which again is what's happening. And so there could be a lot of excess deaths. That is to say, deaths in excess of what there would have been anyway, given the contagion, just on account of that lack of infrastructure. So that's something that the government is going to have to deal with when it comes.
Mm-hmm.
And it does seem like it's going to happen. It's not so much if, rather than, it's not so much if, but more when that it happens at this point. Unfortunately so.
Yeah, it does show the other side of the extreme, I guess, where you can do everything in your power to like stop the spread of COVID, but eventually it's going to get around. So they delayed the whole hit that a lot of other countries just agreed to take earlier. We'll see if their result ends up being overall better than ours. Hard
To
to
be
say.
fair to the Chinese government, which is not something I say a whole lot, but I'll say it here. To be fair to Beijing, they were hit the hardest at first because it started in China, right? It started in Wuhan.
Mm-hmm.
And, just in general, viruses like this, of this variety kind of become more contagious but less lethal over time. But in the beginning, it was more lethal, and there actually was a fair amount of deaths as a result. So you can't entirely blame the Chinese government for overreacting, in the early stages in 2020. They were very worried about, just how deadly it might end up being because they didn't entirely know. There was a lot of uncertainty in that first year.
Mm-hmm.
And when they really cracked down hard, it seemed to work. And so that's kind of the strategy they stuck with in 2020 and in 2021. But by 2022, it was apparent that it just wasn't going to be workable in the long term. And it also became apparent that the party, that is to say, the Communist Party of China, had erred in kind of hitching their legitimacy horse, so to speak, to their ability to contain COVID-19. Because as subsequent mutations became more and more contagious, it became more and more apparent that it wouldn't matter what the government did, that it would eventually just spread out of control, sooner or later.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't blame them for being hard in the first year, but I think the miscalculation was subsequent, in 2021 and 2022, when they refused to calibrate their policy to be more realistic about the evolution of the virus. That's more where the problem was. And so, in that sense, you're right. Other countries that just kind of tanked it, that just sort of accepted the casualties and took more of a middle path in terms of things like lockdowns and backtracing and what have you. Those ended up being more successful in the long term at this point. Uh, doesn't mean the United States was entirely justified in its approach, but given limitations on the power of the federal government, I doubt it really could have played out any other way, especially given how bad polarization was here. So we were definitely underperformers in 2020, but in 2022, we're doing okay. It's still taking some casualties, but at this point, everybody who wants to be vaccinated is pretty much vaccinated. So, in terms of optimal outcomes, this is probably as optimal as it gets for the US.
Yeah. You're going to take some damage somewhere. It's not really like there's a perfect build where you don't have any downsides.
Yeah. Yeah, we're pretty much at Nash equilibrium, you might say. So don't get COVID. That's the takeaway.
Wash your hands, wash your hands, wash your goddamn hands.
That's pretty much the ideal. I guess since we're talking about COVID in China, I did have some notes on that if you wanted to kind of talk about that a little bit.
Sure.
Because COVID has been spreading so much recently in China, there's been a big rush to try to buy medicine, from stores. And the specific items I had listed here were ibuprofen, cold medicines, and COVID testing kits. And apparently, there's been such a rush for these items that there's actually shortages at this point. So it's somewhat reminiscent of the early stages of the pandemic here in the US and in other countries where there were shortages of basic necessities, that people were scrambling to get in expectation that there would be some kind of crisis. So now China is going through that. I don't think it's broad based. I don't think it's like food shortages and stuff like that. I think it is specifically stuff related to medicine, and treatment of sickness, specifically treatment of COVID. There's also been shortages of some stuff that is considered a home remedy for COVID-19, which I thought was kind of interesting. So specifically, lemons and canned peaches have been in high demand and have been seeing shortages. Apparently, there's some talk about vitamin C being key to treating it, and so people have homed in on just food items that have vitamin C in them. But correspondingly, they're selling out. Like stores just don't have that stuff right now. Lemons and canned peaches just can't really be found in a lot of places.
If you're a
Um,
lemon or peach farmer, this is a good time for you.
yeah,
Stonks.
yeah, a lot of turnover there for them. There's also a big rush for electrolyzed water. A lot of people have been going after that. Apparently, it's been marketed as quote unquote helpful with hydration after sweating or a fever. So correspondingly, people have been rushing to buy that as well.
Mm.
There's apparently also some rumors online that drinking high quantities of alcohol can prevent or kill the virus. So people have been rushing to buy that as well. Apparently, the government and media have been going out of their way to point out that that's very dangerous and also not true. That is not going to help you with the virus.
That's like the Rorschach. I'm not trapped in here with you. You're trapped in here with me. You don't want to be in this host, COVID. That's funny.
I thought it was interesting too in the article that I read about this. They noted that hoarding had been common, in the early stages of the pandemic. Uh, but this may be the first time that there were shortages after lockdowns had ended. Normally it's the other way around. Normally people, normally goods sell out in anticipation of lockdowns or during lockdowns, but not really after. That's kind of a new thing. So interesting trivia there. But anyway, was there anything in particular you wanted to talk about today?
Chat, you got anything? I've been in subathon mode still. This is day 19 of
Are you still
21.
doing that?
Yes. I put a 3-week cap on it, and there were a couple days now where the timer got down to 16 minutes. The way that
Oh,
it goes up is if anyone subscribes or donates or whatever, the timer goes up, and it's just ticking down. So, yeah, the hard cap is Wednesday at like 1 to 2 p.m. I'll be wrapping up regardless of what the support has been, just for my own sanity and to actually get a day off. But yeah, I haven't browsed anything. I'm completely out of touch with the world aside from being live and trying to entertain and do the next cool thing. I played through Doom Eternal and I think maybe 70% done with the campaign on Nightmare, which is the hardest difficulty.
oh,
That
wow.
game is really good. It's a very fast-paced shooter. It's got like challenging fights from an FPS standpoint that are really fun. You have a lot of mobility where you have things that cause you to jump. You can like climb on stuff. So it's all about being as mobile as possible. And then it also has platforming quests kind of between that where you need to go from one area to another and you have to kind of look around and figure out what your sequence of jumps is going to be to get from place to place. So yeah, really enjoying that game. My brother's really into it, and that was one of the games that I had meant to do for a while, but with the subathon and being live for so long, I put it as one of the subscriber goals, so I'm almost there. Chat is saying Russia's economy and what sanctions are doing, and then the midterms and Defensive Marriage Act.
Mhm. Okay. Let me write some of that down so I don't forget. Yeah. Act, not cat.
Defensive Marriage Cat. They actually put a cat to defend all marriage.
The brave cat.
Yeah.
See, Russia defensive. What was the other one?
Defensive Marriage Act and midterm elections.
Midterms. Okay. We already talked about the midterms, though, didn't we? Like when they
Ye-
happened.
yes.
Yeah, I think we pretty well covered those.
Cool.
So I'm not. Maybe there's some aspect in particular they wanted to talk about. But yeah, as far as Russia's economy, it's doing okay. Like it hasn't imploded and probably won't. In terms of something like agriculture, they're kind of self-sufficient, at least in terms of just basics.
Mm-hmm.
You know, people people might have to eat more buckwheat, but apparently they're used to that. I was reading that buckwheat is apparently something that Russians eat during hard times.
Mm-hmm.
Like if people think shit is about to go down, they go out and they buy lots of buckwheat. So apparently that's the holy shit food for
Mm-hmm.
them. But yeah, they produce a lot of wheat, so just in terms of food, they should be fine. In terms of stuff like oil and natural gas, sales are still pretty robust. I mean, the oil industry will be fine, most likely. There's always going to be people who are willing to buy, and oil is relatively easy to move compared to natural gas. And I think we talked last time about dark fleets, right? So
Yeah.
there's always tankers, ships out there, cargo ships, oil tankers, what have you, that are going to be willing to service pretty much any market, even if it's just heavily sanctioned and explicitly illegal. So smuggling will always ensure that there is some transportation available. Uh, Prices may be a little higher as a result. There may be a premium charged, and we do actually kind of see that. I can't tell you exactly, what tankers are charging the Russians to move their oil, but I do know that Russian oil is trading at a discount. So I think right now it's something like $30 below WTI. So basically, it's trading below $30 below market prices for normal oil from other producers that are, not facing sanctions from all of the richest countries on Earth.
Hmm.
So, even if they are still selling, they do have to take something of a hit there in terms of revenue as a result. Oil prices did spike for a while, so even if they were below market value, they still saw overall a price increase. But since then, that price has fallen. So oil revenue is taking a hit in Russia correspondingly. But it's not that they won't ever be able to find buyers. India in particular, I think, is set to become Russia's largest export market. So they're quite happy to take cheaper oil. For everybody who is not sanctioning Russia right now, they're actually quite happy to buy Russian oil specifically because it's discounted right now. That helps alleviate inflation a bit in those countries. So that's a ready market, and there's always going to be transportation, so that'll be fine. Natural gas is a little different. That's harder to transport. If the main way natural gas is transported is via pipeline, so that means you need to make a pretty significant investment in infrastructure in order to efficiently move it in large quantities. Now, if you don't have a pipeline, you can still get it, but in that case, you're going to have to buy liquid natural gas. And so, in order to export and import liquid natural gas, you need one, specialized ships that are specifically designed to transport the liquid natural gas at a very, very cold temperature. I don't remember what it is off the top of my head, but it's well below zero. In addition to the ships, you also need special terminals that are specifically designed to load or unload that liquid natural gas onto and off of the specialized ships. So, as you can imagine, all of this requires a lot of expensive investment. And for some countries, they hadn't really been focusing on it that much. I think Spain has a whole shit ton for some reason. I still don't know why. So they were very well prepared. They have lots of liquid natural gas terminals. But Germany, by contrast, did not build very many. I don't, I think they've only got like one. And that's pretty much the one they're having to lean the most heavily on right now. They're going to construct more, but it's going to take years to finish building them. So all told, moving natural gas is just hard, and that makes it relatively expensive. So that's obviously been a big problem for Europe since they're having to scramble to find alternative sources so that they don't, keep funding Russia effectively. But it's also a problem for Russia because if Europe doesn't buy, then the only other major buyer that they have is China. And, China's quite happy to buy from them, but China's also very opportunistic. So it's not like they're going to refrain from pushing for a heavy discount. They have done exactly that. And so natural gas coming from Russia has been significantly discounted as a result. So beyond that, Russia has, they have some liquid natural gas terminals, but it's not really enough to really make up for the loss of the European market. They haven't lost it completely. They're still able to sell pretty significant amounts there. But that market is on the way out. Europe has made it very apparent that they're going to move away from Russian natural gas. And, there's only so much they can do in 2022, but in 2023, the Russian budget is going to start feeling that as the Europeans start finding substitutes. The Russians, for their part, were kind of hoping that they could kind of intimidate the Europeans into refraining from making that shift. There was the prospect of a cold winter in 2022, and shortages. The Russians kind of messed around with the supplies as the Europeans were trying to build up stored natural gas for the winter like they normally do. But ultimately, it seems that has been a fairly unsuccessful effort. So in terms of oil and natural gas, oil will continue to be a pretty decent source of revenue for Moscow, but natural gas is going to be more of a challenge over the next couple years, and more so as time goes on. They are set to finish a pipeline to China soon, an additional pipeline to China. They already had one. But it's probably not going to make too much of a difference. You know, again, the more dependent on China Russia is for its natural gas exports, the more leverage Beijing has in negotiating lower prices. And history over the past 10 years has shown that Beijing is definitely going to do that. If they have to choose between taking higher natural gas prices in order to help their Russian ally and taking lower prices and helping their economy, they've proven to prefer the latter. So that's what's going to happen, and that's going to be something of a problem for Moscow. You know, it remains to be seen exactly how all that plays out. So in terms of markets and exports, more or less they'll be okay. The bigger issue is more the technical side, because even though the Russians own their own, you know, oil and gas industry, they're still very dependent on specific technologies that are necessary in order for that industry to function. So they're not actually completely self-sufficient in that regard. So, you know, things like the technical equipment that's used to extract, you know, the commodities, software used to work that equipment, you know, very technical stuff like that, they're much more dependent on the West for. And the result is that over time, they could get squeezed more and more, kind of in the same vein as Venezuela. So, you know, Venezuela's oil industry, when it was nationalized, was one of the world's top producers. But when the US hit them with sanctions, they were unable to import new equipment, or for that matter, to buy expertise necessary to maintain it. And the result is that over time, the productivity of Venezuela's oil industry fell dramatically. It didn't happen overnight. It was more of a slow decline, but it happened fairly quickly. So not a slow decline, but a steady linear decline, as I understand it. Let's put it like that. So Russia probably will see something very similar. You know, they may be more active and successful in trying to circumvent sanctions in order to try to get the equipment and supplies they need in order to ensure production of key resources like oil and natural gas does not fall over time. But given how proactive the West has been, they're probably not going to get everything they need, even if they manage to get some of what they need. I'm a little skeptical that they'll be able to get everything, such that they'll be able to prevent a decline in production. So there's probably a structural decline in output coming for those industries in Russia. And that's not something that's going to happen in 2023, I would expect, but it is something that's going to happen over the long term, like over the course of the next 5 to 10 years, probably. That's small comfort if you're Ukrainian. I'm sure you would hope for a much shorter time frame for that. But that's just the realistic outcome. You know, they can probably prop up output for a while in the short term, but in the medium to long term, they're just going to get squeezed harder and harder. So let's see, that's core commodities, agriculture, manufacturing. So there's kind of a tale of two cities there in terms of Russian manufacturing. Part of the Russian manufacturing sector is state dominated, and a lot of that is specifically defense related production. And then on the other hand, there's private sector production. So Russian manufacturing, after the Cold War ended, really took a bad hit. And as a result, you know, kind of like with the oil and natural gas sector, they really got to be pretty dependent on imports of machinery from the West. I think specifically Germany is who they were mostly importing machinery from. And the private sector was never really able to fully recover. You know, there were certain, I think, light manufacturing sectors that were kind of okay, but heavy industry required a lot of state intervention. And even then, it just became very dependent on support from the West, you know, for maintenance, equipment, etc. So at this point, the manufacturing sector, specifically the public manufacturing sector, which is important here because that's the sector that's producing all of the weapons and ammunition for the Russian army right now during the war. They're going to be okay in the short term as well, but in the medium term, the lack of access to Western expertise and manufacturing equipment is going to start to hurt. And it's already starting to squeeze the private sector. I was reading that the automotive sector in Russia has already seen significant declines in production on account of sanctions pressure. So the public sector has state support, and so they're able to circumvent sanctions to a degree. There's already a pretty robust smuggling effort on the part of the Russians and their allies to try to get equipment that they need in order to continue producing weapons for the war. And I think there was something in a major newspaper recently, I don't remember which one, about talking about how microchips in a lot of Russian missiles, because they're able to recover the wreckage of the missile after it's been used. And when they look at them and do forensic analysis, they keep finding Western chips in them. Some of those chips were stockpiled before the war, but they're also finding some that have been sourced more recently. So apparently, the Russians are able to continue to get those. So the degree to which they'll get them will determine how much output they'll be able to maintain. One would assume that one would assume sanctions would be tightened more over time, such that the inflow would fall over time. But never underestimate black markets. So we'll see what happens on that count. But at least for the short term, I do understand that production has been squeezed even in the defense sector and even with the smuggling going on. So that has put something of a crimp on the supply of ammunition, for example, which I've seen a lot of analysts online argue is facing shortages at this point. I've seen them argue that there's shortages of ammo on the Russian side since the start of the war, though, so I'm a little skeptical at this point. I'm going to wait and, it's one of those things where you kind of believe it when you see it. But nominally, from what I've read anyway, from my preferred sources on the matter, the Russians are facing a pending shortage of ammunition on account of production squeezes stemming from sanctions. And presumably that'll get worse as time goes on. So on the defense side of things, on the public manufacturing side of things, they're doing okay in the short term, but as the medium term approaches here, they're starting to encounter problems. For the private sector, they're already getting hit. And I don't know what plans Moscow has for that, because, even if Russian manufacturing is not really as large as Western manufacturing, and even if it's not as efficient, even if it's not as large or efficient, or not as important in the Russian economy writ large as, say, oil and natural gas, it's still an important soak for employment. So, as the Russian economy struggles more over time, presumably employment will be a problem. So I would assume that Moscow will try to make some effort to prop up private sector manufacturing just so that those jobs are available for people, so that there's not a spike in unemployment as the squeeze on the Russian economy gets tighter. But I also don't know if they necessarily have the money to do that. They're making billions of dollars in revenue from oil and natural gas, obviously, but I would assume that a lot of that money at this point is going towards two things. One, sanctions busting procurement, like I mentioned before. Even if they can get that stuff, they're going to have to pay more for it because, of course, smuggling invariably adds a premium, that they have to pay extra for. In other words, paying extra to the middlemen involved. The other thing that they're going to be spending a lot of money on is propping up the economy generally. And by that, I mean specifically propping up finances, specifically the government's finances and the ruble. I think everybody remembers the big panic at the beginning of the war when Russia was locked out of the SWIFT banking system. Not all of Russia, actually. That's actually kind of a topic unto itself. But basically, leading banks in Russia and the Russian government were locked out of the SWIFT banking system. And the result was a panic, that resulted in itself a collapse in the value of the ruble, a collapse in the value of Russian bonds. There was a lot of financial pressure there. But it rebounded relatively quickly because the Russian government was very proactive in dealing with it. They implemented a lot of restrictions that inhibited the outflow of foreign currency that was in Russia. And they also put a lot of restrictions on the sale of Russian assets. So that's kind of stemmed the tide. But that also costed money. If the Russian government wants to raise money for the war effort or wants to protect the value of certain key strategic assets in the financial sector, they have to spend money. So that combined with the smuggling effort and just war expenditures generally, that's soaking up a lot of that revenue, most likely that they're getting from the Europeans from sales of natural gas and oil. So I don't know if they really have a lot left over at this point to prop up the private sector, but I could be wrong. It just kind of depends on how much money they have and how they want to prioritize its usage. Yeah, going back to I guess, well, the services sector was what I was going to talk about next. So finance is kind of a big part of that. So it's not actually the case that the West has implemented all of the sanctions that it could on Russia. It's been said that Russia is the most heavily sanctioned country on earth at this point, and there's truth to that, but most of that truth lay in the number of sanctions rather than the extent. There is actually a lot more that could be done in that regard. If you tally up the individual number of sanctions implemented by every individual country, they all add up pretty quickly. But right now, you can still buy natural gas from Russia if you're, say, European. And they've actually, they're actually still buying a pretty decent amount of oil as well, which kind of surprised me. They are moving to kind of ban the import of oil, but that's not going to be until like next year. So it's going to be a while. So that can't be said of, say, Iran or Venezuela. The oil sectors in both of those countries were heavily targeted by sanctions. So, right away you can see that there's definitely room for an expansion of sanctions on Russia. But even if you look at something like financial sanctions, it's not the case that the whole country was subjected to the SWIFT banking ban. Rather it was specifically the Russian central bank, the government, and a couple of the major banks. But a lot of the smaller banks, medium-sized banks even, those actually still have a considerable amount of access. And I've also read that commodities traders in Europe can actually still do business with oil and gas firms in Russia, interestingly. So even if you're in a country that doesn't allow the import of Russian natural gas, intermediaries, that is to say, services firms that specialize in the purchase, transport, and sale, of commodities actually can still do that. They can still carry on with their business there. So there's still a lot of specifically firms like that and firms in the financial sector, banks and whatnot that have not been subjected to SWIFT banking restrictions. Those could be targeted in the future. And that would have a fairly significant impact if they were. Because right now, given the sort of imbalance in how sanctions have been applied, some banks have been sanctioned, others not. There's lots of room for sanctions busting. There's lots of room for people to find loopholes and little firms here and there who can continue to do business. And that not only facilitates sanctions busting, but it also facilitates some of the normal activity, basically normal low-level services sector activity. So, for example, if you're just like a YouTuber who makes money off of your money off of YouTube, you can probably continue to make money if you can find the right bank or the right loophole or what have you. It's probably very inconvenient. There's probably still a lot of problems, and a lot of issues in the Russian banking sector on account of the restrictions, but technically it should still be possible if you can find the right avenues. So sanctions have had a mixed impact on the services sector. That's kind of the general point here. Not everybody in the services sector, specifically finance, has been sanctioned, and so there's still some room to maneuver as a result. That doesn't mean it's a free market. Again, the Russian government levied a whole bunch of restrictions on the financial sector in order to kind of do damage control. And it may be that if they lifted those sanctions, then it would basically just return to February 2022, right, in terms of the significant downward trend in markets in Russia. So probably those restrictions aren't going anywhere, but at the moment anyway, still a mixed bag, I would say, overall. So that's the financial sector, broadly speaking. There's also the tech sector. And, I think everybody knows what I'll say about that. There's been a big exodus out of Russia of tech sector workers who have been looking to get out, some looking to avoid conscription, because that was a big fear when mobilization was first announced. Some of them just more on principle, they don't want to support, the regime, so to speak. And, just others for their own reasons. Some maybe just worried about general conditions in Russia, the possibility of unrest, the war spiraling out of control. Or maybe just who don't like the general trend towards repression, which has been kind of the trend in Russia for a while now, but definitely spiked in its intensity after the war started. So for myriad reasons, tech sector workers in Russia have been leaving the country, to the point where Moscow has implemented measures to try to incentivize them to stay. Because those workers are, a useful part of the economy. They provide expertise in the cyber, area, which the Russian government needs. And they also provide a decent amount of tax revenue in terms of the taxes on their income that they pay. But of course, one of the big advantages of the tech sector is that you can be very mobile as a worker in the tech sector. You don't necessarily have to be physically in one place or the other. So tech workers can be very flighty as a result. And I don't think that the Russian government's efforts to try to keep them are going to be very successful. It's just too convenient to just move in order to deal with a problem as a tech sector worker. And, a lot of them are pretty freelance too. So it's not even that they necessarily have to work for a particular company. Like if you work for a Russian tech company, you can move, and just sort of telework with them from outside the country. But you can also just change jobs. You just find somebody else to work for. So you don't even have to worry about dealing with Russia at all in that sense. So that's a twofold problem. One, it's a problem for the Russian government because they're losing tax revenue, and they're also losing expertise. Some of those people could come back later, so that loss of expertise is not permanent, but I would imagine the Russian government would prefer to have it on hand in the short term, given the war. So that's one problem, but it's also a problem for the tech sector itself in Russia, in so much as there's brain drain going on. There's people leaving the sector and therefore creating what I would imagine would be at least minor shortages of manpower. So I don't know how bad that's been. I haven't read anything to the effect, so I would assume that it's been pretty manageable thus far. But if there's continued brain drain and if there's a lack of a corresponding ability to import new replacements from abroad, then they're just going to get squeezed, and that's going to be a problem for them going forward. So that could result in tech firms in Russia relocating out of the country or engaging in a lot more telework, using people in other parts of the world. There's a lot of would-be tech workers who might appreciate the work, working in places like Africa or Latin America or Southeastern Asia, where they have a lot of human capital, but not always dynamic economies that are capable of generating jobs for them.
Whenever a country suffers from something like brain drain, how long does it take for it to hit them? Because it's not going to be immediate, because if they're innovating technologies and stuff, then people can more or less still use them for a while.
Well, I guess it would depend on what you mean by hit. Because if you're just a very poor developing country, like a sub-Saharan African country, for example, not all of them are poor. Not all of them are dirt poor, but there's a number that are, like Zimbabwe, for example, Zambia to a lesser degree, one of those. In those cases, they take no hit per se from brain drain, because they started from such a low level that there's not really like a negative repercussion. There's not like an immediate drop that you can point to and say, oh, that's because of brain drain. The issue is more opportunity cost, because presumably if those graduates had stayed, graduates or tech workers or experts in general, if those people stayed in their home countries, presumably they would be able to generate more economic growth by way of investment, business creation, etc. That would have created more growth for the economy writ large, that is then foregone because they do not stay. So that's the opportunity cost. That is more the hit, so to speak, that is taken by developing countries from brain drain. So there's not really quickness in that sense. It's more just a perpetual thing. Like perpetually, Africa and other developing regions of the world generate new experts, new graduates, new human capital, generally speaking, and just lose it just constantly because there's just always better opportunities abroad that attract them away from their home country. They still benefit some in the form of remittances, but that's not the same thing. You would prefer to see business creation, knowledge creation in your own country so that that can kind of build over time. There's a kind of cumulative effect of having economic activity sourced geographically, and it kind of builds on itself. That's kind of what you would call that's what economists might call economies of agglomeration, where you see an economic activity happen in a specific area, and then corresponding related economic activities happen around it. And then there's further economies that are generated just by being sort of spatially located there, because all of those people are able to just talk to each other, interact, share ideas readily, and that generates innovation that results in new economic activity, and it just kind of it's a virtuous cycle that spins out from there, basically. So even if you can kind of benefit from free trade and having everybody everywhere producing a little bit of everything, there is definitely some benefit to having production in a specific place in a specific time. And that kind of helps reinforce comparative advantages that allow you to further compete in a free market. I'm kind of getting into a tangent, but you get the idea. It's not an immediate hit from brain drain that happens. It's more just a perpetual cost in terms of foregone opportunities.
Mm.
Now, if there's something like Russia where you have a specific event that causes brain drain, in that case, you could see more of a short-term impact. So some of the impact is immediate in so much as there's like a wave of people leaving. So you can kind of see some impact on industry and tax revenue right away. But in terms of whether or not this brain drain is going to hobble key industries in Russia that are dependent on that human capital, it's too early to tell. It'll probably take longer, and it'll depend on the extent of the brain drain. Whether it continues to be of a large scale and for how long that continues. Those are the key variables. That's the thing to watch. If there's a lot of people that continue to leave for several years on end, then yeah, the tech sector in Russia is just invariably going to take a hit. That's when you'll see businesses closing, relocations, stuff like that. But if it's just a short-term spike and then more of a low-level brain drain, that's probably manageable for them.
So it depends on what the size of the impact is going to be. Of the people who I know from Russia for like content creation purposes, getting money has been quite a bit more difficult. I don't know like all the ins and outs of that, but it definitely did have an impact on like the common internet person who makes their money online to a global audience. It's definitely a greater than zero inconvenience to them for sure.
You ought to ask them how it's changed over time, because in the immediate, at the start of the war, that's when it was the worst, because everybody panicked. Everybody just assumed Russia was going to get completely locked out. And so nobody knew what to do. Everybody was freaking out and trying to figure out what would work. But I would have guessed that in the months subsequent that things kind of quieted down. So that would be my question for them if I could if I could ask them. I don't know how recently you've talked to them, basically.
Yeah, closer to the start of the conflict than recently.
Yeah. Let's see. Finance, tech. I guess that's all I could think of off the top of my head as far as the impact of sanctions on the Russian economy. I guess sanctions hadn't really impacted the tech sector all that much, other than say like things like payment. But just I was speaking more generally, I guess, in that sense. But yeah, overall, they're holding up, but they're definitely going to have problems in the long term, if not the medium term. But in the short term here, they've held up relatively okay, probably better than expected, given prognoses at the start of the war. But we'll see if they can continue to hold out. I think that's sort of the $1 trillion question at this point. The war in Ukraine at this point is very much a grudge match. It's more about who's going to be able to last longer. Who can survive attrition at the front, who can survive economic pressure. You know, that probably more than anything kind of defines the course of the war at this juncture. We shall see. But hopefully that was a satisfactory answer. That was kind of a grab bag of different sectors of the Russian economy and how they're being impacted by sanctions. I guess I'll throw out the usual disclaimer here. I'm not an expert in everything I talk about on here. I have more of a background in economics and public policy and foreign policy to a lesser degree. So, if I ever say anything wrong, stupid, or biased, please do correct me. If I'm wrong, I want to know more than anybody. I don't read chat while we do this, but, I will see it later. So, feedback is definitely appreciated. I do enjoy seeing people, debating in chat and correcting me and kind of giving me interesting bits of information to think about. I always kind of learn something when I go back through chat. So let's see, that was the Russian economy. And if somebody asks a question and I don't really answer it to their satisfaction, or if I miss the point of the question, which I've done before, do feel free to elaborate, and I'm happy to return to it, and try to do it right, so to speak. So let's see, that's the Russian economy. Defensive Marriage Act, that was just kind of for show for the most part. I don't know that if the Supreme Court actually does end basically marriage equality, of one kind or another, not just gay marriage, but also the interracial marriage, which apparently they're also looking at. I don't know if the Supreme Court ends those things, that a federal law would really matter that much. Because I kind of suspect there would be a lawsuit over it and that the Supreme Court would very seriously consider striking down the law. Because I don't know that the Constitution really allows the federal government to do that. Maybe if they worded it in a very specific way, such that it's just referring to things like, funding or something. But I think beyond that, the Supreme Court kind of acts as a deterrent there. Well, not deterrent, but the Supreme Court would strike it down probably, I'm guessing. So I'm a little dubious about the actual utility of the federal law here that's been passed. I think I did read somewhere that the law itself is mostly just about trying to tell states that they have to respect each other's marriage licenses, if I remember correctly. So, even in terms of the content itself of the law, it's not really doing all that much. But I'm not a lawyer, so maybe take that with a grain of salt. Maybe a federal law would be useful. I mean, at the very least in the short term, maybe, at least until it can work its way through the courts, as it inevitably would. But yeah, in general, my attitude on it was just that it was political theater, by the politicians. I don't read too much into it. If you're worried about your rights being taken away, I would not look at this law and think, oh, okay, I'm good. That's not the takeaway. So I don't think it's time to rest easy just because that law is on the books. Well, let's see, what else did we have here? Well, was there anything else you wanted to get to, or should I kind of start into some of my stuff here?
Hit your notes. I have been in streamer jail with the subathon.
Pretty lucrative jail, from what you were saying.
Hell yeah. Thanks, Chad.
Well, did you hear at all about the big corruption scandal in the European Union?
I did not.
Yeah, there was a couple of MEPs, that is to say, ministers of the European Parliament, who were found to have been bribed by the Qatari government. There's a pretty decent amount of money that's been recovered thus far. I think 600,000 euros was seized from one MEP in particular. I think that number might have gone up since that story was first released. I think it was Belgian police that arrested the perpetrators, or the suspects, I should say. One of them was actually the vice president of the European Parliament. It's a woman named Eva Kaili. Kylie, I'm not sure how to pronounce that. But they've been charged with corruption and money laundering as of now. It kind of makes sense that she was one of the ones who was bribed. She's apparently responsible for the Middle East as vice president. That's sort of part of her portfolio. So maybe no surprise that the Qataris kind of homed in on her as far as bribery. Yeah, the prosecutors have said that, kind of quoting from the article, I took notes from here, they suspected a Gulf state had been influencing economic and political decisions of the parliament for several months, and specifically by targeting aids. So apparently, this isn't just like a one off thing. Apparently, the Qatari government has kind of been making an effort recently, if not longer, to try to influence political outcomes in the European Parliament. And they were just now able to kind of snag them for it. I'm not sure how impactful it could have been. I mean, the European Parliament is not known for being a powerhouse in European politics. It was almost kind of an afterthought itself. They didn't actually create the European Parliament until, I want to say, like the late 90s, mid late 90s, something around there. One of the big knocks against the European Union historically has been that there's a lack of representation. That is to say, the public do not really have a lot of input into its inner workings. The European Union bureaucracy, specifically the European Union Commission, which I believe oversees it, has members that are appointed by governments. That is to say, the states of member countries appoint representatives to the council. So there is some kind of second or third hand representation there for the going public in that sense, but that's not very satisfactory for critics. There's also the Council of Europe, if I'm not mistaken, and I believe the members therein are appointed. Well, I don't think they're even really appointed. I think they're basically just the foreign ministers of member states. I would defer to Chad on that. Maybe somebody there can correct me on that. But either way, it's the governments making appointments, not the public. And so, in recognition of that fact, member states went out of their way to try to create a more representative body, and that became the European Union Parliament. And that was just meant to kind of sate people, but the powers of the parliament have always been relatively limited. Again, it was not really created as a part of a whole government, like a single design of government that was intended to all work cohesively together. Rather, it was just created specifically for the purpose of kind of appeasing critics of the European Union. So its functionality, its interfunctionality with the rest of the European Union and the institutions thereof is a little wonky. They've kind of had to create linkages over time and give the European Parliament new powers over time in order to actually make it somewhat relevant. But even now, it's much more limited than, say, a parliament in an actual member state, like Congress in the United States or the Parliament in the UK. Well, neither of which are members, but you kind of know what I mean. The Parliament, for example, I think cannot, for example, cannot introduce legislation. They basically get a veto on bills and regulations that are passed by the European Union Commission. But otherwise, they can't actually introduce new things. Maybe they've changed that in the past couple of years so that they can introduce some new things in specific areas. But as far as I know, they still can't. So again, that just illustrates how limited it is as a representative body. So that's just to illustrate that Qatar bribing people in the European Parliament, maybe not as big a deal as you might think. I would be a lot more interested if they were bribing people in the European Union Commission or even the Council of Ministers. That would be a much bigger deal to me. But that said, it's still a big deal in and of itself just because it hasn't really happened before. And because, from what I've read, the nature of the bribery was particularly brazen. It wasn't the kind of corruption that we in the United States are used to. Lobbying firms here in the United States are quite subtle in the ways that they influence political outcomes and politicians. outright bribery is generally not on the table.
So they
Uh,
basically like throw money at someone's super PAC or campaign fund rather than just giving them money straight up.
well, there's that. There's that. But even more subtle than that is generally how they do it. And they don't even just target politicians. Actually, regulators in administrative agencies are also themselves targeted. And so I think the bigger way that they influence outcomes is the so-called revolving door. So, for example, somebody works in industry, then they leave industry for an appointment in an administrative agency. And then, lo and behold, as soon as they leave that agency, they're back working for their old firm, or maybe another leading firm in that industry that was being regulated by the agency they were working in. So you can't really prove that they were being influenced by their old firm or the industry generally while they were working in government. But it's kind of established and known that if you play ball, then you have a job waiting for you when you get out of government. So just by being so generous to people when they leave government, kind of illustrates that there is kind of a temporal bribery going on. They don't explicitly say, hey, if you administrate in a particular way or judge in a particular way, then we're going to give you a job in the industry with a lot of benefits. But at the same time, you know that if you don't, maybe those jobs are not there for you when you leave government, and maybe you have to find something else to do. So the revolving door is not explicit bribery, but it's an implicit form of influence by which firms and lobbyists can try to influence behavior. Now, I would point out it's very difficult to ascertain how successful they are. It's just kind of inherently difficult to point at political outcomes and administrative outcomes and determine exactly the degree to which they were influenced by lobbyists or politicians or political considerations generally, as opposed to the professional, objective measures by which they're supposed to make those decisions. So I can't say for sure that there's explicit bribery going on and that this is a very successful effort. The point I'm making rather is just that influence operations in American politics are very subtle, and probably in Europe and the European Union, they're also very subtle normally. Again, one of the things that makes this corruption scandal stand out is how lacking in subtlety it was. So, again, the Qataris were not trying to influence people. They weren't trying to, go to them with information or trying to influence them by trying to convince them of a particular viewpoint. They weren't kind of indirectly trying to give money to them by way of campaign contributions or giving money to certain think tanks, or they weren't doing a revolving door thing where they were saying, hey, maybe there's a job for you waiting if you kind of play ball here and do what we want you to do. Rather, they just straight up gave them money in exchange for votes. So that's the kind of corruption that is easier to catch and determine. If somebody gives somebody a large sum of money and they vote in a way that is very favorable to that actor, pretty clear cut. There are explicit laws specifically barring that. So that is against the law. That is very clearly bribery, and that's what's at issue here. I also thought it was worth noting here that one of the people arrested was a guy named Pier Antonio Panzeri, and he apparently runs a human rights group called Fight Impunity, which I thought was a little ironic given the circumstances. So a little bit of drama in Europe, probably a little overwrought given that it's, the parliament, but still worth mentioning. Also worth mentioning, given that the World Cup is in Qatar right now, and Qatar has kind of come under considerable scrutiny regarding its human rights record. So, not the best look to have everybody pointing their finger at you, accusing you of human rights abuses, and then to turn around and find out that you've been bribing their politicians. Not the best PR for Qatar lately, in other words.
Yeah, but that was one of the things that you talked about with the norms of corruption in general, is that in some places it's just not really seen as big of a deal to, you know, make an exchange. Say, hey, we want this, you want that, I'll give you what you want if you give me what I want, and it's all chill and they don't really fuss about it too much. But in a country where it's more seen as wrong, then yeah, that's going to affect people's reputation, and they're going to get pretty upset about that.
Mhm.
So
Yeah,
Qatar,
expectations really sets the tone there.
yeah. So Qatar's like, wait, we're not supposed to do this? Oh.
Yeah, in some countries, if you try to be corrupt, people weird out on you and turn you in and report on you. In other countries, if you're not corrupt, people get mad at you because it's the norm, right?
Yeah.
It's expected. So if you're not doing it, you must be doing it to piss them off or spite them or otherwise fuck with them.
Yeah.
So it makes them raise an eyebrow, it makes them think, oh, this guy's up to something.
Mm-hmm.
Because, of course, he's not being honest. He's not going to refuse to be corrupt because he just thinks it's wrong. He must be up to something.
Mm-hmm.
So that's very off-putting, of course. So yeah, expectations. That's pretty much one of the core elements determining how corruption is received in politics. And it's very difficult. It's very, very difficult to uproot uh, a political culture in which corruption is just the accepted norm. Like it's almost impossible. Like even if you're a politician who gets elected because you promised to deal with corruption, everyone will just expect you're bullshitting. Like as soon as you get into power, people will just be like, okay, of course you were bullshitting, so here's all the corrupt shit we expect you to engage in and help us with.
Yep, here's your bribe, and now do what we tell you to do.
Yeah. Yeah, and you can kind of see that play out. Guatemala is kind of one of my go-to examples for that because they had successive presidents come to power elected on an anti-corruption platform and then immediately just engage in very suspect behavior,
Mm-hmm.
specifically regarding an anti-corruption investigative agency that was set up by the United Nations to help them deal with corruption, and which then successive supposedly anti-corruption presidencies went out of their way to try to hobble. Go figure. Oh, did you see the outcome of the World Cup?
I did not. Who won?
Oh, okay. I don't want to spoil it for anybody, so are you sure you want me to know? I'm sure you want me to tell you.
Anyone who doesn't want World Cup spoilers, mute the stream for 5 minutes. Okay, go ahead.
Okay.
I don't follow soccer ball.
Okay. So Argentina was able to beat France, and so they are the new World Cup champs.
Oh.
And it was a big deal because their top player is apparently a guy named Lionel Messi, who's considered like one of the top or the top soccer player, but one of the criticisms of him is that he'd never won a World Cup championship. So now he has, and his legacy has basically been cemented. So full credit to him. Congratulations to Dagnip. I'm sure he's very excited. And there was some footage on Reddit from a city down there showing people celebrating. It was they seemed pretty excited. People do love their soccer or football, if you prefer. Oh, you want to talk about violence in Ethiopia?
How's it going over there?
Yeah. So the peace deal with TPLF is still in place, so the war in Tigray seems to be over. That deal is holding for the moment. There have been some complaints from human rights agencies and groups that they still haven't been able to get full access to Tigray, but for the most part, everything seems to be going okay. Like the TPLF hasn't cited that as a reason for, rising up again or anything. So that peace process is on track, which is good. But I've also read recently that the Oromo Liberation Army has been getting more active. So this is an ethno-nationalist militia in the center of Ethiopia, specifically in the province that is ethnic Oromo in nature. I would point out here the ethnic Oromo are the most numerous ethnic group in Ethiopia. So one of the trends in Ethiopia over time has been, rising ethno-nationalism among this, that, or the other ethnic group. And ethnic Oromo nationalism has been a particularly impactful form of nationalism. And the unrest that has come with it has been one of the determinants of political outcomes in Ethiopia. For example, the previous government that had headed Ethiopia before the current one, led by Prime Minister Abiy, was actually led by the TPLF, or at least TPLF leaders. And the reason that they lost power to Abe was specifically because of protests in Oromo territories. They were upset because the government had expanded the territory for the capital province of Addis Ababa. They were taking land from the surrounding Oromos, and that, of course, pissed them off. And so that resulted in long-running protests that eventually were successful in seeing a change in government. Not a change in regime, mind you, but just a change, I should say change in leadership would be more accurate. So Abiy came in, everybody was very excited, and then of course things kind of went downhill, with the Tigrayans, with COVID, the pandemic, with the locusts. We talked a lot about that back in the day, etc. So there's been a lot of problems, but even through all of that, the Oromo protests and violent activity by this militia, the OLA, that never actually stopped. It was kind of a low intensity conflict that was brewing in the heart of Ethiopia. And the Ethiopian government was dealing with, ethno-nationalist violence in other provinces, and it was dealing, of course, with the pandemic, the war in Tigray, etc. So they were focused on other things. But now they're able to kind of shift focus more to the OLA. And the OLA, for its part, has been using all of this time to try to build up. So it is actually getting to be a force of concern. It's not really strong enough to actually overthrow the government or fight a conventional war. Right now, it's mostly terrorism. But they are building, they are growing in size sufficiently to be able to take villages here and there in the countryside. And apparently they've been holding graduation ceremonies there for people. They are graduating as members of their organization. So this is something to keep an eye on. The Ethiopian army can probably contain them, but it's a question more as to whether or not they'll really be able to stop them. And if they continue to commit acts of violence against the state and, more to the point, against rival ethnic groups, there could be a spiral of reciprocal ethnic violence between different rival ethnic groups. And I kind of single out the Oromo here just because they're the largest. Their ethno-nationalist groups are, just by dint of the population being larger, themselves are then larger. And the result then is that when they are violent, the violence kind of carries more weight. So whether or not the Ethiopian government can navigate all of this ethno-nationalism amongst its different ethnic groups is going to be a big determinant of the country's ability to achieve any degree of stability and, by extension, progress. One of the knocks against Abe from the start has been that he was too open. One of the things that he was lauded for in his first years was easing up on government censorship and allowing more free speech in Ethiopian politics. And, in general, that's a good thing. You want more open political systems, but of course, if you have a lot of ethnic rivalries in your country and a lot of large ethnic groups in your country that are capable of acting on those rivalries, that can be a problem. And that's what happened. People said that if there was too much openness in Ethiopian media, then far-right ethno-nationalist groups would exploit it, and the result would be militia-based violence. And unfortunately, that's what came to pass. Maybe the Ethiopian government under Abe was hoping that it would be more of a passing thing, that there would be a period where there were far-right radicals trying to incite people, but that eventually civil society would be able to restore order, so to speak, in the public discourse, and would achieve or implement some kind of comedy between the rival ethnic groups that would serve to deter the impact of the incitement from the radical groups. But, again, that just hasn't been how it's played out. The ethnic radicals have been able to just make more and more ground and get more and more support over time. So, if you're the Ethiopian government, you're damned if you do, damned if you don't. If you continue to allow a fully open media space, then you're probably just going to get more ethnic violence. At least that's how it seems at this point. But if you impose government censorship again, that isn't necessarily going to work either. Again, government censorship comes with its own problems. It radicalizes people. They get paranoid. Conspiracy theories proliferate. And the government kind of delegitimizes itself because, some stuff that you don't want spread is not spread because of the censorship. But there's also a lot of legitimate criticism of the government that's invariably also going to get covered up. And the result then is that the government will be less responsive to the public and in turn will be less legitimate because it won't be able to act on problems either perpetrated in the private sector or by the government itself.
So, what is the strat for getting a country to stop being so ethno-nationalist? Do you
If you
like?
find out, you should tell the United States because we'd like to know as well. There's no clear-cut playbook on that.
Hmm.
Maybe the best case scenario is economic growth. Because here in the United States, a lot can be forgiven in exchange for a decent income and a decent job. During periods of economic growth, people are kind of focused on making their money and building a life for themselves. And if they're making enough money, then they can kind of afford to work around controversial social problems. It's during economic downturns and hard times that social issues are exacerbated because people can't pay their way out of them. If you have a problem with race, like in the United States, then you can end up with the private sector self-segregating. We've kind of seen that even after the civil rights movement and the end of segregation in the United States. There was still a fair amount of segregation. There was a fair amount of self-selection of people into particular communities. Some of that was the result of racism, redlining. But even amongst the African American community, there is still some preference for relatively more homogenous African American communities. So that's kind of a consistent thing you can see in the United States and in other countries. So that's easier to do when you have economic growth, because then everybody can kind of make money and then it's fine. But when you have a decline, then you start seeing disparities. So African American communities in particular, for example, are generally disproportionately hit by recessions in the United States. And as a result, that then exacerbates other political tensions that are peripheral to day-to-day life. If people are making money, maybe normally they don't think about issues like that too much. But if you're not, then suddenly it becomes a catalyst for radicals to try to get to people and radicalize them as well. So money, basically, money is the answer.
If
It's not
people
a parody.
are more well off, they're less likely to fight.
Yeah,
Hmm.
yeah.
That makes
It's
sense.
you know, trade acts as a kind of pacifier in a lot of ways. I've even seen it argued that trade serves as a civilizing influence, in so much as it disincentivizes violence and warfare, and incentivizes the construction of institutions that facilitate rule of law, public safety, uh, and commerce generally.
Yeah, another thing too, I'm just thinking on like a human psychological level, is if there's a demographic of people that maybe your ancestors were racist against, for example, and you have a regular business kind of deal that you do with them where maybe you buy some manufactured good from them or they provide some service for you and it's like something that helps you. You're like, hey, these are cool people who I do business with, and it builds reputation in your mind. I think one of the more moderating influences that people can have on how they view different demographics is to actually collaborate with them. Like if you collaborate with people who are from a different demographic from yourself, you'll kind of realize that they like a lot of the same shit that you do. They have a lot of the same traits as you, and they have a lot of the same problems as you. One of the things that growing up for me was kind of spooky growing up was we were told like, ooh, LGBT people, like that's scary. That's something that you should watch out for, and they're not trustworthy, stuff like that. And then when I worked in fashion retail, a lot of the people I worked with there were gay or something. And I noticed that, hey, like they have their relationships, but they don't threaten me. They don't make me feel out of place. They don't pressure me or anything. And the ones that I worked with, they had really nice, uplifting relationships with their partner. And I got to see their partner show up to work and visit and just be really well balanced and nice and kind to that person, where it seemed like they were both happy. And I was like, oh, I was told that this was like a really spooky situation by the previous generation and just the prevailing prejudice in society. But by just selling clothes in the same store as these people, I realized they're the same. Like they're just people and they just have a different preference for one thing that honestly isn't my business and doesn't really impact my life at all. So, in that sense, for ethnicity, for religion, for sexual orientation, just like being involved in normal day-to-day stuff, I think opens up people's awareness to the notion that humans are humans. Yeah, there are some differences between us, but they're oftentimes overhyped, sometimes to evil ends.
Frequently to evil ends.
Yeah. Another thing that kind of links up with like gamer BM on the internet is the notion that some people feel really dissatisfied with their life, and one of the ways that they'll try to like gain some ground for themselves is to put down other people. Like instead of actually working on your game and getting better at what you do, some people will just bash their teammate and call them trash and stuff, so that relatively speaking they feel like, well, at least I'm not trash. Like they're not in a high league, but they can put down other people around them so they can still think of themselves as better. A lot of the ethnic, racial, religious superiority can like follow this same line as well, where maybe you don't feel like you have everything you need in life, but at least you're better than that group. Try to be aware when you do that. That's no bueno.
Yeah. Yeah, there's little things you can do here and there in terms of trying to engineer better relations between different ethnic groups that are, rival in nature and have historical baggage.
Mm-hmm.
If you're coming out of a conflict, you can do something like a Truth and Reconciliation Committee. They did that in South Africa, and I think they tried to do something similar in Bosnia. I'm not sure if that worked out too well. I think in the case of Ethiopia, they tried to manage it by basically just giving ethnic groups their own provinces. So pretty much all of the provinces in Ethiopia correspond to the spatial distribution of specific ethnic groups. In other words, each ethnic group has its own province. But of course, that's not an entirely satisfactory solution either, because there's always going to be disputes about whether this, that, or the other bit of territory on the border should be in one or the other province. So this has actually been one of the drivers of ethnic conflict in Ethiopia, because invariably there's some overlap between the land occupied by different ethnic groups, right? There's like a village here that has ethnic Amhara, but they're surrounded by ethnic Oromo. So what do you do with them? Or maybe there's like a 50-50 split, or maybe there's even places where they're mixed in together in individual villages. So there's always going to be weird edge cases like that. And if you're an ethno-nationalist, there's never going to be a satisfactory answer short of annexation of that land into your ethnic group's province.
Mm-hmm.
So one of the things ethnic militias fight about in Ethiopia is about land. And that was that you actually saw that with the war in Tigray, because the ethnic Tigray militia actually fought not only with the Ethiopian army, but also with the Amhara militia. So Amhara is the province immediately south of Tigray. And the Amhara province or state, I think it's province, organized their own militia, and they fought with the Tigrayans, not so much to help the Ethiopian army, but more as part of sparring over disputed territories on their border. And there was a lot of stories of atrocities committed during that violence. It was basically just like Bosnia, where you had a lot of radical militias of one ethnic group or another trying to cleanse the rival ethnic group from a given piece of territory they were trying to take. So the corresponding, atrocities are invariably murder, rape, torture, trafficking, even organ trafficking. I don't know that that's ever been proven, but there's been persistent rumors to that effect ever since the war.
And by organ trafficking, do you mean like they're getting really expensive organ pianos and shuffling them around, or you mean like the insides of people?
No, not the pianos. I'm afraid that the allegation is that they were taking organs out of POWs that they had captured and were selling them on the black market. Pretty shady business, suffice to say.
That would be really funny though if you're part of some like police group and you figure out about this organ trafficking ring, and then you catch them doing some huge deal, and it's like, oh, this is oh, you're just musicians. Okay, well, go ahead.
Carry on. Much more palatable.
Yeah.
But yeah, this stuff like that that happened in Bosnia also happening in Ethiopia. Uh, Recently, it was mostly on the border between Amhara and Tigray, maybe on the eastern border too. And there's allegations that the Eritrean army was doing it on the northern border of Tigray, because Tigray's northern border is actually Ethiopia's northern international border with the nation of Eritrea. Although that used to be a part of Ethiopia, and the ethnic group there in Eritrea has its own historical package with the Tigrayans. Certainly, the Eritrean government and leadership has their own personal historical baggage with the leadership of Tigray and the TPLF. So there's lots of reasons to fight recently in Ethiopia, and people have been acting that out, unfortunately. But since the war in Tigray ended, it's been more the Oromo Liberation Army that has been committing acts of violence. That's more what I think people are watching at this point. But yeah, going back to different ways you can try to create interethnic harmony. Uh, Another thing you can do is just try to educate kids together to try to have what we in the United States would call integration
Mm.
or integrated schools. But also in the United States, you can kind of see the counterexample, which is that the government can sometimes be at pains to try to engineer that. It sounds good on in principle, right? But unless the government actively forces people to educate their kids together, what you'll frequently see is people going out of their way to pull kids out of integrated schools and put them into more homogenous ones. That was especially a trend after the civil rights movement and desegregation here in the US. There was a huge ass controversy for decades after the Civil Rights Act was passed about busing. And it's the weirdest damn thing for me because growing up in Dallas, I it was never really a thing. That's not to say it wasn't a controversy. It's just that the city of Dallas was actually so successful in not doing it that I didn't even know it had ever been tried elsewhere. I had to read about it in like books and articles and things to learn about it. But yeah, there was a big attempt to try to force integrated schools by busing children from minority communities to schools in majority, white communities to try to ensure that there was something resembling equal representation. And man, people were mad about that. Like even in the Northeast, which I would have thought would have been more receptive to it, people were really mad about it. There were major protests in Boston about it, against it. And, as it happened, people just found ways, to get out of it. Like the way it panned out in Boston, from what I've read, is that the relatively well-off communities did not have to participate. And rather, most of the African American students that were bused ended up getting bused to lower income white communities. And well, the schools for lower income white communities, the working class communities. And holy shit, did that not work out well? There was just fighting, like constant fighting in the schools. Like the white kids and the black kids just didn't get along. And the parents just were not a help at all. Like they were dead set against the integration effort from the start. Like,
So
and
they're
that was
probably
not,
egging the kids on, if anything.
yeah, it wouldn't surprise me. So it just ended up being poorly implemented, to put it mildly. And the result was not the desired outcome. I think some schools ended up being integrated later on. They were able to persist, but a lot of kids were just pulled out of the school and sent elsewhere. It was even more dramatic in the South of the United States, which of course has, much deeper and longer running problems with racism. Down there, they straight up shut down whole ass school systems. There was one famous case, I think it was in Alabama. I don't remember exactly. But when they were forced to, actually, this would have been in the 50s when they were first integrating the schools. When they tried to force integration of the schools and to have, white schools allow in black students, there was one municipality that just shut down all of the schools. And there was, I think, several years where there was just no public education in that area. And that was the preferable alternative for politicians there than allowing schools to be integrated. But even after that, even that when they finally, started educating kids again, even after that, there were still problems because what happened is that parents would pull their kids out of the integrated public schools and they would start putting them into private schools. And the private schools had a barrier to entry in terms of tuition that basically prohibited, that served as a de facto prohibition on black students joining, because a lot of the African American families in the South at that time, if not also now, are poorer than the average, white family. And so having that tuition in place prevented most families in given communities from sending kids to those private schools. So the result was that you would have white kids in the local private schools, and then you would have the black kids in the local public schools, and then maybe a smattering of black kids in the private schools and white kids in the public schools. There were some success stories. There were schools that were successfully integrated and remained so for the most part. And, they are still there in the South. But in general, the trend since then, since integration of the school system has been towards more, not less segregation. But in this case, not state mandated segregation, just people self-selecting themselves into de facto segregated school systems. So integrated schools are a good idea. I think studies have been done and shown that they have had a positive impact on the impressions of people on other races and other ethnic groups. But trying to get it to happen in the first place can be difficult if you don't have like a really strong central government. And given how contentious integration frequently is in societies where there's a lot of interethnic tension, it may not necessarily even work even if you have a strong central government, because in that case, people may just freak out even more. And you could have low-level violence intermittently, perpetually. But anyway, that's one possible approach to the problem. There's also just activism generally. There's a lot of efforts in the United States and also in Ethiopia and Bosnia and other places where activists go out of their way to try to have programs in which they get people of different groups together that maybe try to deal with and share their histories of violence with each other to try to kind of clear the air. They try to build leadership. They try to cultivate political leadership that is not antagonistic to rival ethnic groups, and in general try to build political coalitions that span different ethnic groups. So activism has an important role to play, and by extension, civil society. The United States kind of has that as a strong point. American civil society is definitely one of our, key strengths and is one of the sort of lesser celebrated reasons American society is as successful as it has been. But the trouble with civil society is that it generally requires a relatively educated, well-off middle class. That's not to say you can't have strong civil society without it, but it's much stronger with it than without it. And the poorer a society is, generally the less robust the civil society is. So in places like Bosnia or Ethiopia, that's more of a problem because they generally, they've had decent economic growth over the past couple decades, but they're not developed countries yet. And the result is that civil society is not really as strong as it could be. Some of that can be ameliorated with foreign aid. Foreign aid groups sometimes go out of their way to support civil society groups in order to try to prop them up and help engender positive change in societies that suffer from interethnic strife. But there's always a need for more money. Like, you can never really have enough. Foreign aid can only go so far. And you also need people on the ground who are sufficiently educated to know how to use it. And given that education in developing countries is generally not sufficient to produce enough people to really propel not only civil society, but also just the economy generally. We were talking about brain drain before. So even that is not really enough. It helps, but it's just not enough to resolve the problem by itself. So other approaches are necessary in that sense. I think the UK takes more of their approach is generally to take local representatives of a given ethnic group and try to negotiate with them. They even have like whole councils in which different representatives of different groups come together and try to negotiate, or try to negotiate their way through given specific issues, and also just generally to maintain a public discourse and to try to maintain comedy there. So you can also do that. You can try to institutionalize interethnic relations with things like local councils, or having, say, reserved seats in legislatures to try to make sure that given ethnic groups always have a certain amount of representation and that their leaders are uh, always have a chance to be involved in government. That's kind of what India did. India went with the reserved seats option, and all of these come with trade-offs. Like none of these are like a silver bullet. Like with the reserved seats thing, they were able to mollify, not necessarily pacify, but they were able to mollify a lot of groups that have been disadvantaged and marginalized in India historically, specifically uh, the untouchables, the Dalits and low caste people generally, as well as tribal groups, and to a lesser extent Muslims, who have kind of more of a mixed history in India. But these groups were granted reserved seats, so they were able to build legitimacy for the Indian state by ensuring that these groups did not feel like they were going to continue to be marginalized as they had been historically. Because if nothing else, they would have disproportionate representation in the legislature and could fight successfully for their interests. But the downside is that basically commodified that particular style of politics. Like if you can get reserved seats if you're designated as a backwards caste or other backwards caste, then that means that that's a very valuable status that you should, and many ethnic groups and caste groups do, fight to get. And it's become less now at this point about whether or not your given group is actually historically marginalized. It's more about the degree to which you can build a sufficiently large coalition in order to ensure that the government that wins power with your backing rewards you by giving you that special designation. So that's become more of a political football in India rather than a political tool as a result. So the politics around that issue in India basically are similar to the politics of affirmative action, both in India and in the United States. You know, it's useful, it serves a purpose, but it also has no logical endpoint. Like there's always going to be an interest in maintaining that and also expanding the privileges granted and protecting it from change, regardless of circumstances. So basically, it's best to just have a society that doesn't have inter-ethnic conflict in the first place, if you can get it.
Yeah, well, it kind of sounds like you're saying there are some strats, but each strat has its own downside, and there are people who are just going to be resistant to it.
Yeah, I mean, realistically speaking, it's probably just, I don't want to say it's an unsolvable problem, but it's probably just something that's going to be perpetual to some degree, regardless of circumstances and regardless of how you try to deal with it. So trying to live with it and trying to manage it is probably the optimal approach. It's not the most satisfying one, and it's definitely not the most ethical one. Like the ethical approach is to try to face it directly and challenge it at all times and try to forever reach that ideal state where everybody is treated equally and judged by, the content of their character, etc. But there's really just too many shitheads in society to ever really make that feasible. So most likely, yeah, interethnic rivalries will remain perpetual. Again, the best solution is management and money. Just economic growth can kind of smooth things over in a lot of ways. Unsatisfying public policy with John Smith. Thank you for joining me today.
How do we fix this societal issue? We don't know. More news at 11.
Yeah. Yeah, there's a lot of people that put a lot of effort into trying to find ever more innovative public policy solutions, but it's always a mixed bag in terms of impact. And sometimes there's even negative knock-on effects, just depending on how it's designed. It's always a work in progress. So all of those tangents stemmed from Ethiopia, which is what we were talking about. We can branch out pretty far on here. How are we doing on time? Oh, wow.
We got like an hour 20.
Oh, that's right. We started a little later today, didn't we?
Yeah.
Okay. Well, let's see. I don't know if you wanted me to use his name or screen name, but somebody on Twitter was asking me to talk about Twitter files So had you heard about that?
No, what are Twitter files?
So Elon Musk, whom is the, now owner of Twitter, has released some documents to a few hand-selected journalists, which illustrate what he argues is implicit left-wing bias in the way his predecessors in the ownership of Twitter had been managing content moderation on the website. And so that's resulted in some consternation and commentary, more so on the right in American politics than on the left, I think. I think it's barely registered much on the left, but conservatives in particular have been talking about this of an example of how their views and opinions have been, well, had been anyway, marginalized by Twitter and probably are continuing to be marginalized by the tech community more broadly, which they note generally has a left lean to it. And so that's led into a further related conversation about the power of tech companies in their ability to influence public discourse and, by extension, their ability to influence political outcomes in the United States. So I'm a little skeptical about just how impactful they really are. So in general, content moderation stories like this, and there's been quite a few content moderation stories and scandals over time. I think Cambridge Analytica was one of the big ones back in 2016, with regard to Facebook and the 2016 election in the United States, as well as the Brexit referendum vote. So these kinds of stories are not new, but for me, they're always kind of unsatisfying because, for one, there is no consensus approach to content moderation on social media. Realistically speaking, there will always be people unhappy with how you do it. Invariably, there will be people saying that you didn't go far enough and that you should have done more to stop this, that, or the other person or group from contenting, from posting, rather, whatever content they consider harmful. But on the other hand, if you try to appease that group, then invariably there's people who are arguing you're going too far. You're not allowing, a free range of ideas to proliferate. You're not allowing public discourse to kind of do its thing and operate freely of interference.
Well, the crazy thing about this is Twitter is a private company, and it's really hard, I think, in general in society to reach a point of true neutral. Like, is there a company that does that? That is actually true neutral in the middle? I think every company, if you list it off, it's going to have a leaning in one way or the other.
Yeah.
Like Home Depot, I think, is right leaning. Maybe Lowe's is left leaning. So if you want to buy a 2x4, you can get a conservative 2x4, a progressive 2x4. Like, okay, it's not exactly meant to be a marketplace of all ideas can go. Like, you're going to have some non-random set of people who work at the company, and they're going to have their opinions on stuff. And sort of as we've learned with government and politics, is if you have 50-50 and it's perfectly even, then nothing can get done in either direction. So sometimes you have a more left-leaning solution to a problem, or you have a more right-leaning solution to a problem. But you're going to need to do some kind of moderation for platforms in general. That's just a fact because of like criminal shit that's going to be on the platform. So beyond the criminal shit, how then do you moderate the next wave of stuff? That's a bit of a more open question that has more potential answers to it.
Yeah, you're right about businesses having biases and customers having the discretion as to how they direct their consumer dollars corresponding with that bias. The criticism of Twitter, though, is that Twitter has a unique role in the political discourse, given how large the user base is and given how influential the content posted on there can be. There's a sense that they should be subject either to more government oversight or that the website should be more even-handed in its content moderation, even though the bias of its content moderation is technically and legally at the company's discretion. So those are sort of the criticisms. I think regardless of the criticisms, though, the fact that Twitter is in the legal right here and can kind of, content moderate however they want is not very comforting, because what they're concerned about is not really perceptions of bias, so much as it is government regulation. Because like any business, government, like with any business, the ownership is concerned about government regulation because they're concerned it's going to be designed in a stupid way that's going to negatively impact their operations and by extension, probably their bottom line.
Mm-hmm.
So even though Twitter can kind of do what it wants here, it also recognizes that there's a lot of political demand on both left and right for the government to step in and set more guidelines as to how social media companies perform content moderation. And so avoiding that eventuality is actually one of their core objectives as a business, which is why these criticisms of bias and whatnot actually do have bearing on their decision making and behavior. Like they are concerned about that. They're not concerned about losing business per se. Again, it's more about concern over possible government regulation, which again, they don't want to have to put up with. Politicians are dumb. They don't want to have to deal with that kind of dumb. They would prefer to just deal with their consumers. They're used to that. But politicians, they can be very difficult to correct when they make a mistake. And often the mistakes they make can be very long running once they are made. Better to avoid it in the first place.
Mm-hmm.
Let's see. So yeah, that's kind of where the criticism is levied. The right thinks that they're being discriminated against. The left thinks that that Elon Musk is opening the gates of hell and is letting all the Nazis out and whatnot. And Twitter, for its part, is mostly just concerned about government regulation traditionally. Although Elon Musk may or may not have ulterior motives here, it's not entirely clear. But regardless, my point here is that there is no consensus on content moderation. So stories like this don't really excite me because I know that regardless of what the outcome is going to be, we're going to be back where we started eventually, which is that everybody is upset about the state of content moderation.
Mm-hmm.
So there's that. Also, I guess I already kind of touched on it, but it's an unregulated space. So, even if there is some discrimination, it's kind of what you would expect regardless, given that it's unregulated. So no shocks there.
Mm-hmm.
Let's see. Yeah, talked about that. Oh, also, it's just inherently difficult to kind of create a code of conduct regarding content moderation. Well, let me rephrase that. It's difficult to codify content moderation in a way that you don't constantly have to change and update. Because, as anybody who spent any time online, and certainly anybody who spent time reading comments online can tell you, people are crazy, but they're also crazily innovative. Like whatever rules you put in place to try to control behavior, users will find a way around that. They will just go out of their way to fuck with you deliberately, frequently. So content moderation is not so much something that requires a set of rules to be put in place. It's more of something that you constantly have to adapt to a changing situation. So it's inherently dynamic. But that's a problem because people want fixed rules in place, not just so that there's a sense of predictability, but also because that makes it easier to discern whether or not there's bias. Because if there's fixed rules in place, then you can't argue that rules were changed just to mess with this particular group. You can say, okay, well, whatever happens, the rule was already in place and you should have known. But if the rules are constantly changing, then you can say that the rules were changed specifically to discriminate against a particular group, whether they were or not. Just the fact that they're changing leaves you vulnerable to that, because people will go out of their way to interpret a change in a sort of offensive, discriminatory way, regardless of context. So the fact that the innate nature of content moderation requires constant changes of policy inherently leaves you vulnerable to these accusations of bias and whatnot. So that's also a problem, and is also why, again, the end point of this scandal, in so much as it is one, is that you're just going to return to where you were before. Like there's not going to be like explosive change here that comes from this. I don't even really think the revelations that have been sort of revealed by Twitter files are really all that revelatory. Was pretty much what I expected, but I'll kind of touch on that in a minute. For now, to just kind of finish this point as to why social media moderation, content moderation on social media is kind of a non-issue. Well, I shouldn't say non-issue. It is an issue of substance, but why it's never going to be an issue that results in satisfactory or substantive action. Um, what was it? I even posted this on Twitter. Lack of consensus. I'm forgetting the other point. Anyway, I guess to move on.
It's a shit show. It's going to remain a shit show.
Yeah,
Tonight on Agent Smith.
yeah, that's the gist of it.
Yeah, there's also
That's
not a playbook, kind of like you're talking about for some other issues where there aren't other cases where this has been sorted out before, because Twitter is kind of like the place where people will just off the cuff say random shit, and because it's so low effort to put a tweet online, you have people who are in very high stations saying really dumb shit. And how do you manage that? This hasn't really been a thing that you could do before. Like, it hasn't been the case in the history of the U.S. Presidency that the president could disclose crazy secrets or whatever while taking a poop. But now they can. And that avenue being opened is really, it's really different. So how do you manage that? How do you enforce that? How do you give people the correct amount of freedom, basically, to where people feel like they can speak and they're heard, but also that society doesn't collapse in on itself from sheer stupidity?
Yeah. Yeah, it's a challenging balance. Well, I looked up the point I was trying to make while you were speaking. The other point as to why I'm not that excited by content moderation stories is that I don't think that social media has as much of an impact on political outcomes as critics of social media make out to be. So this kind of goes all the way back to 2016 with Cambridge Analytica, because I was immediately skeptical about all of the conspiracy mongering about, them influencing the outcome of the Brexit referendum and, winning Trump the election in 2016. Like, all of that stuff seemed very overwrought to me as somebody who has actually studied data and analytics, of the kind that Cambridge Analytica was using. Everybody who goes into economics, into an economics PhD program, has to take econometrics. So the methodology therein is very similar to the sorts of brute force, quote unquote machine learning algorithms that companies like Cambridge Analytica use on the big data sets that they get from companies like Facebook and whatnot. So, you can do a lot with that data. You can find a lot of correlations, and you can definitely target advertising to a much more nuanced and finessed degree than was possible before. But the likelihood that it would be enough to actually really change somebody's opinion or, hack somebody's brain, as I heard somebody say in one documentary, no, that's way those people are attributing way too much power to that methodology. Like they can do a lot, but they can't do that. They're not that influential. So just stemming from my skepticism about the impact of social media and targeted advertising and whatnot, and that led me to be very skeptical about other content moderation stories, up to and including this one. So, when people say they interfered, well, this is a criticism that I've heard from the right regarding Twitter before, pre-Elon Musk Twitter. They've levied accusations that Twitter interfered in the election in 2020 and lost Trump the election as a result because they suppressed, for example, the Hunter Biden laptop story. Or because not so much because they banned Trump, because that happened after the election, but, just other efforts at suppressing what was supposedly harmful content, but which people on the right have alleged is just substantive criticism of the left. So there's some truth to that in so much as it, did probably have a political impact, but I don't buy for a minute that it impacted politics enough to swing the election or to otherwise even really substantively influence public discourse. So among the reasons that I believe this, besides the fact that I'm dubious about the power of, big data analytics to actually micro-target their way into hacking people's brains, another issue here is that, where was I going with that?
Cambridge Analytica influencing elections, the bias of Twitter, alleged bias of Twitter.
Maybe I do have COVID and it's in my brain.
Constantly changing moderation policies.
I forgot it, and then I remembered it, and then I forgot it again.
He's in, he's out, he's in, he's out.
Let me get the mouse wheels turning here. Cambridge Analytica. Oh, that's what it was. Self-selection. Okay, that's where I was going with that. So yeah, the other thing besides analytics, when people get onto social media, for the most part, what they do is self-select themselves into bubbles. So it's not as though people on the left were failing to be exposed to the Hunter Biden laptop story because Twitter was, censoring or suppressing that story. People on the left were already basically isolating themselves from that story by just tapping media bubbles of left-wing media and left-wing posters on Twitter, for example, that were basically already ignoring the story. So it really wouldn't have mattered if Twitter had suppressed it or not, because people on the left would not have seen it anyway. You might have seen more people in the center get it, but I doubt it. And the reason I doubt it is that, for one, people in the center in the United States tend to have a right-wing bias, so those people probably would have seen it anyway, either in other right-wing media or on Twitter among right-wing posters that they followed. But also, I don't think it would have impacted the outcome because people in the center kind of shifted more towards Biden in the election, not because of the Hunter Biden, not because of a lack of the Hunter Biden, story gaining traction, but more because of general issues with just Trump's whole presentation. I mean, that's with the midterm elections that just happened, it's pretty well established at this point that suburban centrist voters are very skeptical about Trump and Trumpism. So that's something that we've seen play out several times here. So even if that story had broken, that would not, I suspect, likely have swayed a lot of that skeptical centrist voting bloc that was already kind of disinclined to like Trump anyway. So maybe they would have liked Biden less, but I don't think it would have swung the election enough to really change the outcome amongst suburban centrist voters. Well, if my brain will cooperate, I'll try to move on. So some specific points of interest, specific points of contention here in Twitter files. So one of them was Trump being banned from Twitter. I tried to read through the, I think it's 5 parts that have been released on Twitter now. The journalist in question that the files were leaked to has done a 5-part series on Twitter, kind of talking about and commenting on and sharing some of the material. So among the things that they focused on, Trump being banned from Twitter was one of them. But I wasn't really all that convinced by the evidence. The case that they tried to build was that, Twitter went out of their way to change their rules specifically to go after Trump, and that this was evidence of some kind of malicious intent on their part. But looking at the evidence that was posted, I got more the impression that Twitter just was totally overwhelmed and had no idea how to handle Trump after the January 6th thing. Insert your own label here as to what to call it. But regardless, there was an immense amount of pressure on social media companies to ban Trump, basically purge him from the internet after January 6th for obvious reasons. The trouble that Twitter had is that they had no specific clauses in their content moderation policy that would actually allow them to do that. However, as I said earlier, content moderation is not about having a single code of conduct and sticking to it. You always have to rather adapt it dynamically to changing circumstances. So Trump and January 6th seems like a classic example. Like, yes, it was not technically, nothing he posted on Twitter, rather, was technically in violation of their policies as they were at the time. But at the same time, it's not hard to see why you might want to ban somebody who's allegedly trying to overturn the government and try to hang on to power via unconstitutional means. Therein lies the rub. So does the fact that Twitter changed their policy in light of that fact mean that they had it in for Trump and that they were innately biased? Or does it mean they were dynamically adapting? nobody's going to agree on this. There's not going to be a consensus answer to this question. And I'm not going to tell you what the answer is because it's subjective. And, our thing on here is to just give you information and you guys listening can just make of it what you will. I'm not your mother. I'm not going to tell you what to believe. But I would judge just based on, again, off the evidence that I read in the Twitter files releases on Twitter, that I didn't find this to be very convincing, that Twitter did it maliciously. It seemed more that their team was just overwhelmed, felt they had to adapt it, made a judgment call, and did so.
Yeah, on a more local level, I'm trying to make this relatable to me for just people management. Managing people in the community who are consistently abrasive or who are like towing the line of rules and do go over the line sometimes, but are also well behaved some other points in time. And maybe they do bring value and some people like them. That's a really difficult call to ban someone from something a lot of the time. Sometimes it's really obvious. It's like grotesque and very clear, and they have no clout that they've built with anyone. Those are kind of the freebies when it comes to getting rid of someone from a social group. But then you have the situations where maybe they have a lot of clout with a lot of people within the group. So by removing them, you're going to upset all of them. Is it still worth it to you overall? Those calls are never going to feel good, and they're never going to make everybody happy. So controversial figure on the platform, you're kind of trying to decide, okay, do they stay or do they go? For this case, there isn't really precedent for that. Like there haven't been other presidents who were mouthing off online in such a like direct way that was, in my opinion, unprofessional and also potentially dangerous for the information security of the executive office. So again, every news source has a bias, kind of like Agent Smith's usual disclaimer. Everyone has their own stance on things. For me personally, I didn't like the way that Trump was conducting himself on the platform. So for them to ban him, to me, that makes sense. Like if I was a guild leader and Twitter was my guild, seeing that kind of behavior was like, yo, this is insane. That's not how this is meant to be used. And you have to apply rules. Like you shouldn't have people who have a get out of jail free card for everything. So yeah, definitely an interesting kind of call where you have a private company that has a lot of influence over public discourse. And Twitter also doesn't really have an equivalent peer. That's one of the things that's tricky about this is there are some competing social media platforms that do have a clear conservative leaning, but they haven't quite reached a similar level of popularity as Twitter. But there's nothing stopping people from moving to those platforms. They can do so if they want to. So that's a tricky thing too, is like, yes, Twitter, in terms of how they've enforced stuff, they have more, you could say, loud enforcement of people who have a clear right leaning. So a lot of people read that as, okay, Twitter is left leaning, they're enforcing the platform in an unfair way. It makes sense that people have that perception for sure. But you're going to have to enforce the platform somehow, and you're almost never going to have a perfectly neutral platform. That's kind of an open question for me. If there's anyone in chat or in the comments who thinks of a company that you would say is true neutral, I'm curious about that. Because I think basically for everyone, you could say that something is more left or more right.
I think it takes a lot of confidence to describe oneself as truly neutral.
Yeah. You're basically going to have a slight left or right leaning on any given issue. So maybe you're saying your average is neutral, or you're totally apathetic and you just don't give a shit about anybody.
Yeah.
I guess
those are the real true neutrals.
Yeah.
Well, just real quick, I was going to elaborate a little more about what I meant when I said the team was overwhelmed at Twitter.
Mm-hmm.
You can see in the evidence very clearly, they did a good job, in the Twitter files releases of showing this, that Twitter's team was itself very confused about the state of their policy. There was lots of inquiries within the company from different branches of the company asking, like, what is our policy on this? Is this our new policy? Can we clarify this? Because they were getting a lot of inquiries from customers, specifically advertisers, that were curious, like, what they were going to do about this. January 6th specifically. And in a lot of cases, the sales teams that interfaced with the advertisers had no idea what to tell them. And they kept asking, company leadership, like, what's going on? What are we doing with this? Is this, what is our policy on this? And there was very rarely a clear-cut answer. So, the discombobulation, just the sheer amount of confusion and lack of coherence uh, in Twitter regarding content moderation, specifically around this, hot button issue here, it says to me not so much that they were trying to change things purposely just to fit an agenda, but rather that they were just trying feverishly and failing, to try to adapt their policy as best they could without seeming like they were, doing it out of sheer spite and bias.
Mm-hmm.
So let's see, Trump getting banned, that was one item of contention. Another one was the Hunter Biden laptop story. Um, I think the issue here was more that they were trying to act preemptively in a way that hadn't been done before. Like normally when they had cases where some content was accused or labeled as misinformation, they would generally wait for it to be verified as such. But with the Hunter Biden laptop story, they jumped on it immediately, before there had been verification. And that's more what set off alarm bells for conservative commentators, because they noticed that this seemed to be inconsistent with the way they had handled previous misinformation cases. So I think the issue there, and I would point out that this is legitimate criticism on they're right to be concerned about this, but I think the issue here is not so much that Twitter was going out of their way to suppress it out of malice. Again, talking about intent here, I don't think their intent was to try to suppress the story to fit an agenda. I think the issue here is that they were very, very sensitive to misinformation happening during an election. Because remember, back in 2016, they got a whole bunch of shit after Trump got elected because because supposedly they had not done enough to fight misinformation during the 2020 election. People were very, very upset about that, mostly on the left. And so Twitter subsequently determined that they were going to try to act more proactively regarding misinformation during elections going forward. Now, you didn't see that much because we didn't have an election until, 4 years later. So in 2020, they probably mobilized in order to try to focus more on misinformation to a degree that they had not done since 2016. Well, to a degree that they had not ever done before, but for the first time since 2016. So it's not so much that it was something new, it was more of a delayed reaction from 2016. I think also, though, the issue is that they had no idea how to do this. Like reading through the Twitter Files releases, you really get the impression that they struggled mightily to find a way to deal with this in a way that would not result in just massive political backlash. And, clearly they failed. So I don't think the issue was, again, an agenda. I think the issue, again, was more that they were trying and failing to find a way to deal with misinformation during an election that was proactive without seeming to be overbearing. And I would add here the Hunter Biden laptop story seemed very much at the outset like a traditional political hit job. And I don't say that out of bias because there's been a lot of political hit jobs. I think anybody who watched the Russiagate thing, where Trump was accused of being a Russian agent and, a mole for Moscow deep in the heart of Washington, that itself was a political hit job. And I said as much for years after he got elected that it probably was not going to go anywhere or result in anything and was probably not substantive. And it seems, in retrospect, I was right. So hit jobs are not uncommon in American politics, or really anybody's politics. But the Hunter Biden laptop story very much, at least it struck me as very much being in that vein. And most likely it probably struck Twitter's moderation team in the same way. They probably saw that and thought, okay, that's probably just another bullshit tabloid story that politicians are trying to pass off as being some kind of substantive investigation. So they were probably very suspicious from the start, and that probably inclined them to be a lot more aggressive than they might have been otherwise with other stories. I would add again here that Twitter's team very much had to make up rules on the fly because there was no like codified systemic way to deal with misinformation during an election that they could implement. Again, all of this was being dynamically adapted on the fly. And you can really see that in the interactions where everybody's arguing with each other and freaking out about the lack of clarity and cohesiveness to their content moderation policy. So those were the two main points of interest that the Twitter files raised. There was a couple others. One of them was contact between Twitter and Democratic Party reps. Supposedly Twitter was in regular contact with reps from the Democratic Party who would regularly raise issues with content that they wanted flagged and removed. And that's substantive. That did happen, but that's also a little bit selective because the same thing was happening with the Republican Party and also with the government. Even the Twitter files themselves illustrate that there was regular meetings between Twitter's content moderation team as well as company leadership and the FBI and with the Department of Homeland Security. And the government at the time was controlled by Donald Trump and the president Donald Trump. So nominally, at least, he had oversight over that. So yes, the Democratic Party was actively telling Twitter that there was content they didn't like and that they thought was in violation of their rules and should be removed. And Twitter did act on some of that, but they were also acting on equivalent efforts by the Republican Party and by the Department of Homeland Security and the FBI and the US government generally. So that was a broad-based thing. I don't think there's anything really there, so to speak. At least that's not my impression now. Again, I'm not your mother. I'm not going to tell you what to believe. I'm just trying to give you a reading on some of these. Some of these accusations are more substantive than others, basically. But the last item here, bias against Republicans generally. Yes, there is implicit bias in the way they were moderating content. It seems like they were focusing more on Republicans than Democrats, but that's also not new. That was something that, what's his name? The previous owner, I forget his name, Dorsey or whatever it was. He actually went on to the Joe Rogan Experience, the podcast, with his top lawyer, I might add. And they actually kind of hashed it out with Tim Pool, who's like a conservative journalist. And they just kind of went back and forth talking about that. And, they made it clear implicitly. I don't think, whatever his name was, the Twitter CEO or his lawyer ever said explicitly, yes, our content moderation has a bias against conservatives. But they did try to contextualize it in a way that implicitly suggested that they were. And the way they contextualized it was by saying that most of their user base is left-leaning, which I totally believe, given the content on Twitter, and that because it's more left-leaning, that they get more reports on conservative content on the website.
Mm-hmm.
So, for some people, that was not very satisfactory and felt kind of like a weak mea culpa, but that actually makes sense from sort of a statistical standpoint. Like, if Twitter is disproportionately left-leaning, it would make sense that most of the reporting was being done by left-leaning people, which inherently means a left-wing bias to content moderation. So in that sense, they're right, but they've always been right about that. The Twitter files is not really saying anything new on that count. I think I did see some people arguing about this on Reddit, and some people were actually it was on Twitter, of all things. But conservatives were making the point that, Twitter as a company had said before that they were not shadow banning, when in fact they were, and that Twitter files kind of proved definitively that this was the case. And I don't really feel that's true, because, again, going back to the Joe Rogan Experience episode where they were talking about this, the CEO and his lawyer kind of made the case that, no, they don't shadow ban. But then they went on to explain what they did do, which was effectively the same as shadow banning.
We didn't shadow ban them. We put them in the realm of shadow, which is different.
Yeah. Yeah. So basically, they were playing with definitions. So the CEO and his lawyer were basically making the assumption that shadow banning referred to completely blocking people from having their content seen at all. And that was a pretty deliberate choice on their part, because I think most people define shadow banning not so much, at least not just as blocking content from being viewed, but also as inhibiting its spread, inhibiting how many people see it as part of the algorithm and as part of the natural recommendation process. So that's more what most people think of when they think of shadow banning. And so I think Twitter's CEO kind of strategically defined it in another way so that he could say they were not shadow banning. So yes, they were shadow banning, but the thing is, they actually kind of explicitly admitted that by giving this weird, circuitous bullshit excuse on the Joe Rogan Experience. So that's kind of on the record. That's not new information for me. So I'm a little dubious about, the veracity. Well, not the veracity, but how revolutionary and how revelatory the Twitter files really are in that particular sense. So basically, I didn't really learn anything I didn't already know reading through the Twitter files releases. Like, there was already an established bias. Uh, it was already known, like I had already known, that content moderation is always a clusterfuck, regardless of context. So
Mm-hmm.
the fact that Twitter was, constantly changing their policy and, constantly arguing with itself internally about what exactly the policy was supposed to be, that's exactly pretty much what I would expect. From what I've seen of mods dealing with communities on like subreddits and stuff, exactly the same. Like there's constant litigation of decisions, constant pushback, constant arguing, and there's never a clear-cut policy in the moderation of virtually any given subreddit. And while you might not think that a major billion-dollar corporation would have content moderation policies as inconsistent and crazy as a subreddit, you would be wrong because there's no inherent reason it wouldn't be. The reasons for content moderation being inherently difficult and chaotic are innate and structural. Like it doesn't matter what the company is or how much money they have or how many workers they have or how skilled they are. Like content moderation is innately chaotic and there will always be churn and there will always be angry assholes accusing you of being out to get them. Sometimes they'll be right.
Oh, whoa,
Sometimes the angry
whoa,
assholes are the mods
oh,
themselves. It
oh
varies.
no! Oh,
But the
what the
point here is
fuck?
that the chaotic nature
Ah!
of content moderation is not in and of itself evidence, in my opinion, of malice or innate agenda setting on the part of a company like Twitter. Now, that's not to say that there were not people in Twitter who may have had their own agenda or their own
Whoa,
intentions there.
oh, whoa,
But the evidence
whoa,
provided in Twitter
oh,
files
oh
does not
no!
illustrate that.
Oh, what the
Certainly it
fuck?
illustrates that some people had their own
Ah!
implicit bias, but it doesn't illustrate to me what exactly they did that would have necessarily thrown an election in a particular way or something grander in that fashion.
So, not the greatest revelations of all time with the Twitter files, but some confirmation of things that were already suspected.
For the most part, yeah. That's kind of my takeaway. And even if you don't necessarily agree with that, I would point out that regardless, the result is going to be the same, which is that we're going to be
Whoa,
right back
oh,
where we were
whoa,
before the Twitter
whoa,
files with
oh,
everybody
oh
angry
no!
about content
Oh, what the
moderation. So
fuck?
really, what
Oh!
substantively does this mean? Not much. At most, maybe it builds a better case for politicians to try to do more to regulate social media. But that brings us back to the point that there is no consensus about content moderation, which means that any political effort to impose government regulation is almost certainly going to fail because Democrats and Republicans will sabotage each other's efforts to try to impose their respective definitions of what good content moderation would look like. So because of that political deadlock, nothing political will happen, even if there is more political support for it. Which means, again, nothing will happen. Like, again, we're back where we started. And it's just inherently predictable and unsatisfying. And to go back where I started this with, that's why I don't care. Like this is invariably how all of these content moderation stories pan out and unfold. Like everybody gets really angry and they're very upset and they lob accusations and they demand action and then nothing happens.
Hmm.
And I see no reason why the structural factors behind why nothing happens have changed sufficiently to ensure that it would be any different this time.
Yeah, maybe it's just that they need to vent a little bit.
Well, that's like 90% of political discourse online.
Yeah. Yeah, chat was saying that there was also an active vote on Twitter by Elon Musk of whether or not he should step down as the head of Twitter, and it's like 56% yes.
I don't think that's going to work.
Yeah. If we learned anything from Brexit, it's that doing like off the cuff referendums, don't assume that it's going to go the way that you hope that it will. Assume that it's
Yeah.
going to create a huge 10-year shit fight.
Yeah. That's whenever it's close, especially, then
Mm.
yeah, nothing is truly resolved in that case.
Mm.
Actually, Scotland had that referendum on independence. What was it? Whenever, 2015 or whenever it was. And it failed by like a decent margin, like 10 percentage points, 15, something like that. But then Brexit happened, and then immediately, a lot of independence supporters in Scotland felt that changed the context.
Mm.
They felt that some people had voted to stay who might have voted to leave if they had known that the UK was going to vote to leave the European Union a few months later.
Mm.
So Scotland started lobbying hard for another referendum. And just recently, the High Court, the High Supreme Court, I don't know whatever the highest level of court in the UK is, they voted, not voted, they determined that Scotland could not hold its own independence referendum without the permission of London,
Mm.
because they had been thinking about trying that, given that London had been stonewalling them for years after the Brexit vote on whether they would allow another referendum. So they had been teasing the idea they might just do it themselves. But then now the courts have intervened and said, no, that is explicitly illegal. You cannot do that.
Well, they could always take up the sword of William Wallace again. Braveheart theme intensifies.
They can try. They can try. I don't know how far they'd get. I don't even know how much support that would even really have. I think, it's one of those issues where people are passionate about it right up until it actually inconveniences them.
Mm.
Yeah, that's probably the biggest reason the United States has not had a second civil war. We're just a little too fat for that. It would require us to spend money and do things besides comment angrily on the internet. I
Also,
don't think people are game for that.
risking yourself in a violent contest is something that people like to run their mouth about, but actually doing that and being in trenches is not a good time.
Oh, yeah.
Would you rather have a bag of chips and be on the couch browsing the internet, or being cold and wet in a trench and being shot at? Most people will go with the bag of chips on the couch.
Yeah. Yeah, fighting for what you believe in sounds very romantic, and it can definitely drive people to do inspirational things. But
Hmm.
yeah, once you're in the trenches, it's kind of hard to be inspired. It kind of sucks the life out of you a little bit. Yeah, everybody thinks that if they go to war, they're going to be the war hero. They don't think they're going to be that first guy in the Higgins boat who gets shot as soon as the ramp falls.
Yeah. Well, were there any funnier and lighter things that happened this week that aren't left versus
Stupid
right?
shit.
Yeah, what's some stupid shit that happened?
I don't think I had anything especially stupid.
Well, Chad got very excited by the reference to the locusts and the ducks. That was one of our favorite stories ever. I was actually telling my girlfriend about that one recently, about how it was like an old school animal battles of like, shit, we have a way too high population of this animal. It's messing up our crops. What should we do? Well, I don't know. What counters locusts? Ducks. All right, let's get a plane full of ducks and just yeet them at it. Okay, we got all the ducks. All right, the ducks ate all the locusts. But now we have way too many ducks. What should we get? I don't know. Let's get a plane full of cats and we'll just throw it at them.
Well, one thing I did have is I had some video footage of a border clash recently between India and China.
Mm.
I guess since you've been busy, you probably didn't hear about it, but that did make the rounds on Reddit for a while.
Mm-hmm.
It wasn't anything big, because again, for those of you who are maybe not familiar with this, we've talked about it before, but The border between India and China along the Himalayan mountain chain is disputed, or at least two specific parts of it are disputed. And the result is that there are occasional clashes between the respective armies of the two nations over said disputed territory. And those disputes were pretty rare until 2020, but then in that year, Beijing kind of went out of their way to start pushing more forcefully to try to get some of that disputed land. But the interesting thing is that both governments have a kind of informal agreement that neither one will actually arm their soldiers with firearms, nor will they deploy as part of their armies in those respective regions things like artillery or other heavy weaponry. So the result is that when these clashes happen, they're generally not lethal. Rather, they just consist of soldiers beating the shit out of each other, frequently with sticks. So we saw a little bit of that in 2020 when there was a big fight between two large units of infantry beating each other with sticks. A couple people actually did die. I think one of them died after he accidentally fell in the nearby river. But recently there was a minor clash again. And I don't really have all the details or context about this, but there is footage of it. And there did not seem to be any larger ramifications to it. I haven't heard anybody in Beijing or New Delhi really complaining about it that much. Let's see, Neuro. Discord.
Wasn't there one of these fights where they were like using swords and stuff? Or am I imagining things? Because it's just that they can't use firearms, right?
Yeah.
You could use an axe. Axe battles in the Himalayas.
I don't think I've heard about a sword recently.
Okay, that would be pretty crazy.
Yeah, nothing's coming to mind. Again, I forgot. Let's see. And then there was some more flooding in Portugal. I meant to send you that earlier. Here we go. Oh, I guess, let's see. I had another minor item on the China's space program. It's not really either here nor there, but just some interesting trivia. But there was a Chinese rocket that re-entered the atmosphere after a launch, I think of one of their satellites. And there was apparently some concern about the debris falling on a populated area. And so there was actually warnings in Europe that, it may fall somewhere in that territory and that people should be aware. And apparently that's a problem that's fairly unique to China, because apparently China does not design its rockets to break into small pieces that burn up on reentry, which is apparently the international norm. So, Russian rockets, American rockets, European rockets, they're all designed such that this isn't a problem. But for some reason, China apparently does not. So occasionally then that can result in incidences like this, where debris can potentially fall on a populated area and create problems. So again, not really here. Again, not that big an issue, but interesting trivia. Maybe somebody more familiar with space exploration and technology can kind of tell us why they do that, because I imagine they must have some specific reason.
Reminds me of a video that I watched this week, just chilling during the subathon, where there's a guy who makes like booby-trapped boxes for porch pirates and stuff, and he was making some for people who break into cars. And people who break into cars have these little items they put on their glove that are like a just concentrated metal spike where they can punch it pretty lightly and it'll shatter the window into a bunch of little pieces. But it's just really satisfying to see someone who stole some shit from people, like a nice Christmas present they were about to get or something, and it just like spits out two drones that just throw glitter all over the room, and then there's a fart smell like thing that makes the room like really stinky and stuff, and they have to run and throw the thing out. One of the videos. The kid knew about this YouTube channel of the guy who does this. They're like, it's a scam. I've seen his YouTube. Get this out of here. And he like takes the box and he's running it outside. And then he throws it like into the garbage bin or whatever. And then he peeks around the corner to watch it to see what happens. It's just one of those cases where I think it's San Francisco is the city where they have like an insane issue with car break-ins, where a lot of people just leave the trunk of their car open all the time because they would prefer to have their vehicle checked by thieves rather than to have their window broken. Pretty crazy stuff. Where's Batman when you need him? Don't steal from people, chat. Thank you.
We actually did not talk about Ukraine last time.
Do you have an update?
So I do actually have some stuff on that.
Nice.
Are we doing okay on time?
Yeah, I got 30 minutes.
30 minutes? Okay. Let's see. One of the recent big developments was escalation. So basically, the United States and its Western allies have been kind of cagey about the weapons that it gives to Ukraine. They've been pretty generous overall, but there's some technologies and weapons that they just don't want to give because they're concerned that it might spark an escalatory spiral with Russia.
Mm-hmm.
But more recently, two things have happened. One, the West has gotten a little more skeptical about Russia's threats that it would escalate in the event of, this, that, or the other eventuality. So that's resulted in less risk aversion. And then the other thing that's happened is that the Russians have started just going all out, trying to destroy Ukraine's electricity network.
Mm-hmm.
And that's also led to a greater willingness to try to supply Ukraine with arms. And so this manifested in the past 2 weeks in drone strikes. Now, it's not clear if the Ukrainians got the drones from the West or not. We don't know what kind of drones they are. But the fact that they're doing it at all is itself an escalation. And what the Ukrainians did is that they launched drone strikes pretty deep into Russia itself. Well, relatively speaking, Russia's a big country, but specifically, they targeted the air bases in Russia from which bombers are being launched that are launching the cruise missiles that are striking power stations, electrical plants, etc. And they have done some damage in that regard. So Russia, of course, retaliated with that, with its own volley of missiles further going after the electricity network. But then the Ukrainians did it again a few days later. So, they also launched some drone strikes against the headquarters of Wagner Group in Lugansk in eastern Ukraine. Did some damage there. So this seems to be an uptick, not only in the pace of drone warfare on the part of Ukrainians, but also in the scope. They're hitting some targets in pretty deep into Russia now that they previously had not been. I would guess they're most likely doing it with support from the West, possibly material support, but certainly in terms of intelligence support. Most likely it's the West that's giving them the coordinates to these bomber bases and giving them information as to where the strikes on their electricity network are actually coming from. The Ukrainian government, for its part, has not denied that it was them that did it. They tend to be very cagey about incidences involving strikes or sabotage happening inside Russia itself. But they did note somewhat coyly that if missiles are to be launched against Ukraine, it shouldn't be a surprise if something happens at the source where those missiles are coming from.
Mm-hmm.
So kind of an implicit admission that, yes, it was them,
Mm-hmm.
although somewhat ambiguous, leaving some room for doubt. So this does open the door for, escalatory spiral, but, nothing that's happened since the war started, hasn't fallen in that category. So this seems then to open the door to further drone strikes within Russia itself. And there's a whole range of targets they can go for. I mean, there's logistical centers like ammo depots, fuel depots. They can go for command and control centers where, generals and other officers are. They can go for transportation nodes, communication nodes. I mean, there's a whole range of stuff they can go for. for now, they seem to be restricting themselves to targets that relate to the strikes on their electricity network, so bomber bases and etc. But they could escalate depending on, the willingness of Western supporters to kind of facilitate it and the willingness of Ukraine to do it. Now, again, given that the West is becoming less risk averse over time, it's entirely possible that drone strikes in Russia could escalate steadily over time. It could be that there's a handshake agreement that Russia will stop attacking the electricity network if Ukraine agrees to stop launching drone strikes in Russia. That's possible. I doubt we would know about it if it happened until like well after the fact. But I also don't know that Russia would be willing to do that, given that they're laying out a lot more damage proportionate to the amount of damage they've taken in terms of these ranged strikes. Mm-hmm. But that's something to keep an eye on. We'll see how that goes. I think the more important thing here, the more important takeaway here is that the West is willing to allow this, because before they had really actively discouraged Ukraine from striking targets in Russia for fear that the Russians would retaliate and escalate. But now that that fear is on the wane, the West is much more accepting of this. They've already said that they do not encourage it even now, but not encouraging it even now is not the same as actively telling them not to, which is what they were probably doing before. Mm-hmm. So that raises the question of what else Ukraine is going to be able to do that they were not able to do because of Western opposition. And it also raises the question over the medium term as to how much more the West is going to facilitate as far as Ukrainian action against Russia, not only in Ukraine itself, but in Russia. So some relatively minor events that could have big repercussions here over the course of Western involvement in the war and Ukraine's ability to defend itself. Yeah, definitely keep an eye on that space. Also, there's been persistent rumors kind of percolating that Russia is planning a major offensive next year. For some reason, this is news. People have been sharing it as such, so I'm bringing it up. But I don't think it should shock anybody that Russia is planning another attack next year. That's pretty much what I'd assumed they were going to try to do once they were able to sort of regroup their forces and get that huge cohort of Mobics mobilized. That is to say, conscripts mobilized. So let's see, in terms of diplomacy, there was some news. The United Nations said that Belarus is going to allow Ukraine to transport its grain exports through Belarus and then on to Lithuanian ports for export. So that's interesting. If it's true, and if it's credible, and if Belarus actually follows through, that would actually help Ukraine alleviate some of the pressure on their grain exports, which again is one of their main exports. That would alleviate some of the pressure caused by the Black Sea blockade that the Russian Navy imposed. That blockade is not complete. There was an agreement made to allow Ukraine to export grain through Odessa and through the Black Sea, and Russia has been honoring that agreement. But the fact that Belarus would do this is an interesting signal on their part, because if something were to happen to that Black Sea agreement, then presumably Ukraine would have the Belarusian outlet available as an alternative. Now, that's not a complete substitute. I don't think they can export as much through Belarus as they can export through Odessa and the port thereof. But it is an interesting signal from Belarus that maybe they're not completely invested in their alliance with Russia, and certainly not in full cooperation over Ukraine. Now, maybe I'm reading too much into it. Maybe if there were some kind of breakdown of the Black Sea agreement, then Russia would pressure Belarus to also end its agreement with Ukraine vis-a-vis grain, and that they would scupper the agreement in short order afterwards. So in that sense, this agreement doesn't mean anything. But Belarus, the only reason I would suspect otherwise is that the Belarusian government has been sending a lot of mixed signals over the course of the war. They allow the Russians to use their territory as a base of operations from which to launch their invasion into the north of Ukraine, but their own military does not participate. And when the Russian government asked them to, they came up with excuses not to do it. And of course, since then, the Russian military has withdrawn from Belarus for the most part. I think there's some new units that were deployed there for training, but not much else. And in general, Belarus has just been very non-committal as to its role in the war, beyond just acting as a platform. So this seems like another signal to that effect that yes, we're allies of Russia, but we're also not really in it to win it. We're basically just in it in so much as what Russian pressure makes us. And even then, we may resist some of that pressure in order to avoid being further involved in the conflict. So some evidence there, basically, that Belarus is not that interested. Further evidence, anyway. Oh, did we talk about the WNBA player being released?
No, actually.
Yeah, she was released. She was traded pretty much as predicted for Victor Bout, the Russian arms dealer who had been in jail in the United States.
Mm.
So pretty much as predicted. It's kind of a celebrity for celebrity deal. I don't think that Victor Bout was actually like a Russian asset, like some people have been making him out to be. He's more of a well-known pseudo celebrity in Russian media. They kind of make him out to be a spy, but I don't know that there's actually much evidence of that.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so I kind of discount some of the criticism that the deal was bad on the part of the United States and the Biden administration. Some people have argued that we should not be trading what amounts to a celebrity for an actual spy. Those are supposed to be spy for spies. Basically, is what you're supposed to do.
Yeah, basically trade someone who has a similar type of role.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
if he's
And
an
I've
arms
also
dealer,
heard,
that's a more military thing, whereas a
yeah,
sports athlete is definitely a different category.
yeah, and I've also read criticism that this is going to incentivize further kidnappings of American citizens by hostile governments looking to make trades to get important people released. But I don't really think that's too substantive because, again, from what I've read, Victor Bout is not really a Russian asset. And in so much as that's the case, this is more about Russia getting somebody that the Russian public thinks is a high level, Russian asset, and then making it look like they made a good deal than it is about actually securing some kind of really efficient spy. Most likely he's just an arms dealer who just was very good at his job for a long time.
Mm-hmm.
That doesn't inherently require a lot of connections at high levels of Russian government. There's plenty of corruption in Russia, so just knowing the right people at different levels of the military or the bureaucracy is quite sufficient for an arms dealer. So in that sense, I don't think this sets a bad precedent. In so much as that's true, it has not been verified definitively that Victor Bout is not a Russian asset. But the fact that he's a Russian celebrity in the Russian media kind of suggests to me that he's not. I mean, there's not very many spies that get to be celebrities, right? That's kind of antithetical to the profession. You're not supposed to be well known.
So to clarify his role, he is a Russian citizen who
Yes.
is an arms dealer, but he's not like in a branch of the military.
No, no, he was independent as far as I know.
Oh, so he has like a gun dealership basically, but it's pretty big scale.
Yeah, he was pretty prolific back in the day. I don't doubt that he did deals, with Russian operatives of one kind or another, but they were probably not the only operatives he dealt with. You
Mm-hmm.
know, the black market has lots of demand, so there's no need to be picky.
Mm-hmm.
And again, you don't have to have the support of a government to be an arms dealer. There's plenty of weapons that people in positions of power are willing to sell just out of corruption and out of self-interest. And there was a lot of Red Army surplus too in Eastern Europe that just kind of got lost, especially in the Balkans. So there was plenty rolling around there for export.
Oops, we dropped trucks full of guns.
Yeah. But she is free. She's back home. She's quite happy. So, you know, in so much as, well, that's a good thing. So yeah, it's worth celebrating.
Yeah, it's crazy too, like the minor infraction. I know there are people who are saying you shouldn't bring weed to another country on the plane. That's very true. Don't do that. That's a valuable lesson to learn. But people make mistakes, and that was definitely a silly one. But being held in a Russian prison for that long for that offense, like people do that kind of crime all the time, and they get punished like 1,000th of that degree. So
Yeah.
Definitely, punishment didn't fit the crime, and she was being used as a bargaining chip, and just the status of her being a professional athlete, which means that there's a lot more attention for it. It was a pretty yikesy situation across the board, but good that she's home. Don't take weed to Russia. Take home.
Well, probably best not to go to Russia generally if you're an American citizen. It's
True.
a little bit risky at this point.
True. And this was pre-Ukraine war that she was put in jail, right?
Um, that's an interesting question. I'm not sure. It was right around that time, but I don't know if it was just before or just after. I'd have to look, honestly.
Hmm.
I had not been paying very close attention to her case.
Mm-hmm.
There's other Americans that are still being held hostage, and generally they kind of stay there for a long time. If they get released at all, generally it's a surprise that happens after secret negotiations that you don't hear about
Mm-hmm.
until after the fact. There's actually a U.S. Marine, or a former U.S. Marine anyway, being held in Russia right now. Some people were upset we didn't get him out. But he has a somewhat more mixed record. Like he's a dual, well, he's actually like a quadruple citizen. He's a citizen of like four different countries, and he was apparently discharged from the Marine Corps dishonorably, I want to say. Is that what I heard?
Yeah, chat was just talking about that right before you mentioned it.
Yeah, yeah. So not necessarily just like an honest dude who happened to be a Marine, but kind of a guy with a checkered past who may or may not have been engaged in shady dealings in Russia.
Mm.
But there's no evidence one way or the other. Like, we don't really know why he was there. And even if he was dishonorably discharged, he actually has the profile of someone who could be a spy.
Mm-hmm.
So I wouldn't be surprised if maybe he was some kind of freelancer for the CIA or something. Who's to say? It's all speculation, basically.
Mm-hmm.
But I would not expect Russia to kind of give him up for cheap. I don't think they would give him up for Victor Bout. They've probably got somebody of more credentials that they would want released in exchange for him.
Mm-hmm.
Well, let's see, what else did we have here? We're kind of creeping up on the deadline there. I guess I'll save this for next time because that's kind of long. Oh, yeah, this was an important item. So, kind of referring back to when I was talking about how the West is getting less risk averse. So one of the announcements made in the past week, I think, was that the United States is going to start supplying Ukraine with Patriot missiles. Have you heard of these?
Yes. Remind me what they do.
Surface-to-air missile system developed by the United States, partly to fill a kind of a medium-range SAM role, but also designed to shoot down ballistic missiles, if not also cruise missiles. So we've had them for a while. For a long time, the government and military were very cagey about how effective and accurate they were. And we later found out during the Iraq War that they were cagey for a good reason, because apparently they couldn't hit shit. We deployed them during the first Gulf War, right, back in '91. And one of the things they were deployed to do was to fulfill an important diplomatic mission to Israel. Israel wanted, well, I don't know if they wanted per se, but there was some consternation about whether or not Israel would be a part of the Allied coalition that was being built by the then first Bush administration to liberate Kuwait. And so the agreement made was that Israel would not deploy military forces, but would cooperate in other ways. And that mollified Arab states who then were willing to join the coalition and actively fight in it as well as support it. However, Saddam Hussein knew that sort of that divide between Israel and the Arab states was a point of vulnerability. So we started lobbing Scud missiles, basically these medium-range ballistic missiles, at Israel. And the idea was that by attacking Israel, Israel would retaliate, and then Arab states would be forced into a very awkward position where they might be attacking a state that was itself being attacked by Israel, which is a very bad PR look in a lot of the Middle East, especially the Arab world. So the United States tried to deal with it by telling Israel, look, don't launch any kind of retaliatory strikes on Iraq Instead, let us deploy the Patriot missile system there, and we'll use that system to shoot down these incoming Scud missiles before they can hit Israel. And so that was a big sort of diplomatic victory and solution. And supposedly these missiles successfully protected Israel from the Scud missiles. And they went on as basically the main medium-ranged surface-to-air missile system in the U.S. inventory. But then in 2003, by 2003, we had an upgraded version, and the government was willing to admit that actually, during the first Gulf War, and for much of the weapons system's service life, up until the upgrade happened, its accuracy was basically zero. It had never actually shot down anything, up to and including during the Gulf War back in 1991. So supposedly, it's much more accurate now and actually works as intended. Make of that what you will. I can't say how accurate it is. I can't independently verify that, but supposedly it does work. And at this point, the United States is deploying it to Ukraine to allow it to better defend its airspace against these waves of incoming cruise missiles and drones. So that is itself an escalation on the part of the United States to a degree, and it again illustrates the declining risk aversion on the part of the willingness of Washington to provide these kinds of weapons. And hopefully they can deploy it quickly enough and get crews trained quickly enough that they can deploy it and actually, help protect some of these cities so that people don't have to, freeze to death during winter. But the system is a little bit complicated. It takes a long time, from what I've read, to actually train people up. So even though Washington has agreed to deploy them, it may not be until next year that you actually see them on the ground being used. But still a significant step. Very notable in that sense. Let's see. Oh, this is a stupid story. I guess this is what I should have gone with earlier. So let's see. There is rather a high-ranking police officer in Poland. Don't ask me what his position is exactly. It was not mentioned in the article, but this guy was gifted a grenade launcher by the Ukrainian government, or at least by officials within the Ukrainian government. So this guy took his gift back to, Warsaw, and apparently he tried to open it in his office in Warsaw. And there was apparently an accident, and the weapon apparently, quote unquote, went off. So presumably it discharged. So you can imagine that, firing a grenade launcher in the confines of an office is not great.
What the fuck?
Yeah, so he survived. He was fine. I don't think there were even really any serious injuries. But there was some consternation in Polish media about this. It seemed very stupid of him to get this grenade launcher and just to kind of have it blow up in his face like this.
Man. Bro, if you get gifted a grenade launcher for Christmas, that shit is an outside toy. That shit is not a toy. That is a weapon of warfare. You should be out in the field in warfare, or with military people testing that shit. Don't open a grenade launcher in an office. Another pro tip for this evening. Don't take strong weed on the plane to Russia. Actually, just don't go to Russia. And also don't open a grenade launcher in the office, even if you get gifted it for Christmas.
Important lessons learned.
Stay safe.
Stay safe, yeah. Well, let's see. The final item I had here that I'll kind of get to is that Rain TV, which was an opposition TV station in Russia, and I think pretty much the only opposition-run TV station in Russia, which had been shut down by the Russian government for obvious reasons after the war started, and which then migrated to, what was it, Latvia, I think it was. Let me look at that. Yeah, Latvia. And so they set up shop there and they started broadcasting again. However, the Latvian government, that is, just recently revoked their license, and they have basically forced them to shut down again. And this has led to some chortling on, Russian media by Russian nationalists, kind of pointing out that, the West is not this paragon of freedom that it makes itself out to be. Certainly the opposition in Russia, and especially the guys working for Rain TV, were pretty upset about it. The reason that they had the license revoked is that there were three separate incidences, because apparently they have a three strikes rule in Latvia. There were three separate incidences where supposedly Rain TV had either advertently or inadvertently supported the war in Ukraine, which is not legal apparently in Russian media. I think maybe that's a simplification. I think there's something more specific to it, like giving aid to a combatant or whatever, some technicality basically. But because it happened three times, they lost their license, and that was the issue. And the issue, the specific instances were kind of mundane, but you can kind of see where they were coming from too. I think there was one instance where a commentator on Rain TV referred to the Russian army as "quote unquote" our guys, and he seemed to be sympathizing with the plight of individual Russian soldiers, which is not bad in and of itself, but it also had a nationalistic hint to it that the Latvian government didn't really like, apparently. So there were two other incidences in that vein, and so that's why it happened. Kind of seems like overreach and overreaction on the part of Latvia. I don't really know that that was really all that necessary, and it seems like they probably could have given them a bye, but it seems not. So Rain TV is on the move again. They're going to have to find someplace else to go.
We have someone in chat who worked for Rain TV in 2014.
Oh, no shit.
Yeah.
Oh, maybe they're still in contact. Have they been former co-workers, that is, that still work there? Have they been complaining about this at all? Have they talked about it at all? It's always good to get somebody with the first person, or, well, I guess in this case, second person experience. It's one of the fun things about being on here. You know, you get all kinds of people from all over the world in chat, and they can kind of bring their experience to the table as part of these conversations. So certainly I'd be interested in hearing the opinion of somebody who worked there or somebody in contact with people who still work there, what they think of the Rain TV thing in Latvia, having their license revoked and whatnot. But I think that's... Go ahead.
Chat's asking what happened to the Russian journalist who kept exposing Russian positions / armaments.
I hadn't heard about that.
Oh. The Rain TV person said they had an office in Red October back then. Most were disbanded and spread thin since then, basically branded as betrayers of Russia.
Sounds right. An unfortunate situation if you're opposition-minded. Yeah, let me think here. Wait, what did you mention just before that?
Russian journalist who was exposing Russian positions
okay.
or armaments.
There's a lot of what are called military bloggers in Russia, mil bloggers, and they very frequently kind of run around and follow events on the ground, but they also have criticized the government a lot for the poor performance of the army and for providing poor leadership and poor support to the forces on the ground. Now, that's not to say these people are opposition-minded. They're very much nationalists for the most part. So when they're critical of the government, they're not criticizing the government because they disagree with the war. They're criticizing the government because they think the government is screwing up the war. But that's pretty much my only familiarity with bloggers and, well, Russian bloggers following the war. I wasn't aware of any that were opposing the war, that were actively trying to share positions of Russian military forces in order to try to sabotage the war effort. That's news to me. If somebody could post a link or the name of the guy in question so I can look it up, I'd appreciate it, because I would be interested to hear about it, because I hadn't heard about it up until now.
And as we usually mention, if you are from a different country or a country that we've talked about and you know stuff that we don't, feel free to weigh in the YouTube comments. We're just here to learn as well. So we realize that every news source has a bias, and if we're talking about the news, we have a limited perspective too. One of the barriers for us is I think the two of us can only read in English, so any given language is going to have a bent in some direction. But we're trying to figure out what's going on here. But thank you for breaking things down for us and refreshing me on my subathon journey. I'll be done with this Wednesday, like 1 to 2 p.m. At the very latest, and then I'll probably give myself a few days off for Christmas and stuff, and just to be off camera, because I've been sleeping on camera too. So it's almost 24 hours a day on camera, with the exception of bathroom breaks and meals and that kind of a thing.
Oh, very cool.
Yeah.
I'm just looking through the flags here, and I noticed that we had somebody from Cyprus. I don't think we get too many. So, hello to whoever you are in Cyprus. Thank you for listening. One from Mexico, one Singapore, Portugal. How do you pronounce Portugal? Mass Neotech said something in chat about that I caught while I was skimming.
I say Portugal, like
Portugal.
yeah,
Actually, that's correct, isn't it? It is Portugal.
yeah.
Why did I start calling it Portugal?
I don't know.
Lost to time. I started doing it at some point, but I don't remember why.
You have a link for the journalist? Can you post? Yeah, go ahead. Yeah, that's one of the rare things where I can help Mr. Aiden Smith a little bit, is a word that he's read 1,000 times but never heard spoken aloud.
So Portugal.
Portugal, yeah.
Portuguese?
Yeah,
Not Portuguese. Okay.
yeah. It doesn't really get pronounced how it's spelled in English, I think. That's the tricky part.
Well, the more important question is, how is it pronounced in Portuguese?
Mm-hmm.
Because maybe that's what got me changing it.
Chad is saying the way that you say it is closer to the way they would say it in Portugal.
Ah, okay. So I wasn't too far off. I'm not completely crazy.
Mm-hmm.
But I probably should be using the English pronunciation then. Portugal. I'd totally forgotten about that until you mentioned it, and then it just clicked in my head. Like, oh yeah, Portugal.
Okay, I've got the news article for you for the journalist guy. It's from the Daily Mail, which I don't think is the most reputable news source, but it is a news source.
No, no, that's a tabloid.
Tabloid.
But I'll take it.
Yeah.
Yeah, Daily Mail, New York Post, I think it is. They're kind of more tabloidy in nature,
Mm-hmm.
but they have a lot of circulation. Yeah, Daily Mail actually was pretty successful in pretending to be a legit publication on Reddit 10 years ago. I remember reading a lot of stories on there that were allegedly breaking news.
Mm-hmm.
And we get people on Reddit all excited, and then people in Britain would post in the comments, "Don't believe this. How are you so gullible? It's the fucking Daily Mail. Why would you take it seriously?" And Americans just didn't know. We didn't know about the Daily Mail back then. We just thought it was a British newspaper.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's another thing that's tricky for people to figure out too, is like which sites are more reputable than others. A lot of times you can kind of tell by the language of the headlines and stuff, and how bombastic the terminology is. And then another thing is, anytime someone says that X person slams someone else, it's probably not a reputable news source, because they're just going for clicks. If they use those spicy kind of words, that's the almost, I guess, unexpected part about finding good quality news, is you got to go for the boring shit. The more boring it is, the more likely it is to just be dry facts. Just basic, this happened, this happened, this happened. It's hard to find those too, because they don't filter up as much and get shared as often as like the really saucy drama. Yeah, if it's going for rage, it's not worth reading. We try not to rage here in the world discussion time. Some people like that. Occasionally the chat will get a little bit heated. The Twitter stuff, I will say, the chat got a little bit more antsy than some other things. We do have a lot of people from the US, and the US has been pretty polarized for quite some time. I try to keep this a bridge of a community where people from the left side and the right side can hang out together and enjoy video games and conversation, but occasionally the saucy takes will come out.
Yeah. Yeah, hopefully I did the Twitter files justice.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I made my best effort there.
Yeah, I think you did great. The thing that people will, I guess, fall into a pitfall about is they'll start talking about the left or the right as though they're monoliths, and that they can all be thrown into a category. So I would caution people against that. One of the things we can do to like come together is to think about each other as citizens of the country, like as Americans, we need to work on this and this. You could have voted for this person or that person in a previous election. If you hold that against someone over a long period of time, then you're basically excluding them and saying, you are the enemy now, and I'm not going to negotiate with you. But there could be potentially in the future a compromise candidate or someone who's after the people's best interest. And if we have that attitude of cooperation, diplomacy, and friendship, then we can get that shit done. So try to be nice to people if you can. There are lots of advantages to this.
Well said. There's somebody from Kyrgyzstan watching. I don't think I've ever seen Kyrgyzstan's flag in here.
Nice.
Well, I hope they're doing well. I guess my question to them would be what's going on with the border? Because intermittently I've heard about border clashes between Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan.
Mm-hmm.
They never seem to go anywhere, but they also don't seem to be stopping either. And they've picked up since what? Since the war in Ukraine started in particular, I think. They've become more frequent.
Mm-hmm.
Got one from Japan, Spain, Switzerland. Oh. Is that Shea Fatumon?
Could be. I think he would be asleep right now, but he might have the stream open.
Probably.
And then I think our viewer from Japan is Nonstick Pan.
Oh. Well, hopefully things are going well in Japan.
Mm-hmm.
I think the government there is embroiled in scandal right now. 3 successive scandals, basically, are kind of making the current prime minister unpopular, which is a little bit unfortunate because the current prime minister, Fushida, is less crazy than Shinzo Abe was.
Mm-hmm.
I was kind of hoping he might be a moderating influence, but so it goes. Better luck next one, I guess. Kind of like with Peru.
The city that our viewer from Japan is from is Niigata, with 2 I's. Niigata.
Niigata.
It's kind of northwest of Japan, Port City.
Interesting.
I had never heard of it before, so I thought that was cool.
Well, maybe I'll see it on my Total War map. I'm still playing Shogun 2.
Nice.
Yeah, those Kyoto policemen make for very good and cost-effective spearmen.
Kyoto.
Definitely. Kyoto, thank you. I definitely recommend them. Let's see, South Korea. Oh, it's late. You want to go to bed. All right.
That's cool. I'm going to be live for a bit, so not in a huge rush.
Gotcha. Well, thank you for letting me come on. It's always a privilege. Much appreciated. And are you going to be on next week?
I might not be. I'm going to set myself as tentative for next week, depending on how many days I want to take off, because I've been 24/7 on live on Twitch since November the 30th. So if I take more than a few days off, I'm not going to sweat it a bit. But I'll let you know about that.
Very cool. No problem.
Cool.
Flexible as always.
Well, happy holidays and Merry Christmas, and we will see you on the next episode of World Discussion with Agent Smith.
Yeah. Merry Christmas to you too, and to everybody else listening. Talk to you next time.
GG. Nice.